The mafia boss never laughed in 9 years until his secretary did the unthinkable. The termination order was already on the desk before Zuri Bellamy even knew she was being hunted. Han Song-wook had not raised his voice. He never did. That was the particular cruelty of the man. He destroyed things quietly, the way a slow leak ruins a foundation. Before anyone notices, the floor has shifted. He had typed her name into the system at 6:47 that morning, flagged her file, attached 3 words to her employment record that would have followed her out of every serious building in Seattle: emotional manipulation executive. He had done it before she arrived at work, before she poured her first coffee, before she had any idea that the calendar discrepancies she had quietly noted over the previous 2 weeks had made her the most dangerous person in his carefully constructed world. That is how men like Song-wook operated, not with confrontation, with paperwork. If you have ever been in a room where someone was smiling at you while signing your name to something you would never have agreed to subscribe now, because this story is going to make your blood run cold and your heart run warm before it is finished. Hit that like button and drop your city or country in the comments right now, because I want to see exactly how far this story travels. And stay until the very end, because the twist that brings this entire thing crashing down is something nobody inside that glass tower saw coming. Not even him. Seattle had been raining for 11 days straight. That was not unusual. Seattle rained the way other cities breathed continuously without apology, as though the sky had long ago decided that everything below it needed to be kept slightly uncomfortable. The Maru Pacific Holdings Tower sat at the edge of the waterfront with its glass face turned toward Elliott Bay, and on mornings like this one, the whole building seemed to float inside low gray cloud, disconnected from the rest of the city, existing in its own pressurized atmosphere, which was, Zuri Bellamy had long since decided, entirely appropriate. She had worked on the 41st floor for 11 months. Long enough to know the building's rhythms, the way a sailor knows weather, not from instruments but from feeling. She knew which elevator slow on Tuesdays. She knew that the espresso machine in the executive kitchen produced something genuinely undrinkable before 9:30 in the morning and something almost good after 10. She knew that the cleaning staff moved through the executive corridor between 6:15 and 6:50, and that if you were in the building before 7, you would catch Marcus, the night security supervisor, eating a breakfast sandwich at the lobby desk with the particular guilt of a man who knew he was not supposed to be doing that. She knew all of these things because Zuri Bellamy paid attention. It was functionally her entire job. Her official title was Executive Secretary to Kwon Jae-hwan, President and Chief Executive of Maru Pacific Holdings. Her actual job was considerably more complex than that title suggested. She managed his schedule, his correspondence, common travel arrangements, his meeting preparation, a sound like green, and the approximately 47 things per day that needed to be handled before they became problems requiring his attention. She was the buffer between the 4th floor and the 41st floor. She was the person who knew which calls he would take and which ones she would intercept. She was, in the language of people who had never worked that kind of role, just his secretary. Zuri had learned not to bother correcting that particular description. She was good at her job, exceptionally good. Not in the way that gets celebrated at company parties or results in plaques on walls, but in the quiet, essential way that keeps complicated operations from collapsing under their own weight. She caught errors before they reached him. She managed the flow of information into his office with the precision of someone who understood exactly what he could absorb and what would only add noise to an already difficult signal. She anticipated. That was the word people used when they described her. Zuri anticipates. What they meant, but rarely said, was that she understood people. She read them the way some people read weather, not the dramatic version, not lightning and obvious storms, but the subtle pressure changes that came before anything visible happened. She noticed when someone's shoulders dropped 2 degrees below their normal position. She noticed when a usually confident voice went slightly flat. She noticed when people were afraid, and in 11 months at Maru Pacific Holdings, Zuri had noticed that almost everyone was afraid of almost everything, almost all of the time. The fear had a single point of origin. Kwon Jae-hwan was 40 years old, Korean-American, and had built Maru Pacific from a mid-sized logistics company into an empire that touched Pacific cargo terminals, private real estate, and a collection of business interests that the company's public profile described with careful vagueness as diversified holdings. He was lean in the way that suggested discipline rather than genetics, the kind of lean that came from years of not wasting anything, not movement, not words, not attention. His suits were dark and fit precisely. His silver fountain pen lived on the right side of his desk and had never, in 11 months, been moved by anyone other than him. He rarely smiled. He almost never laughed. He did not need to intimidate people with volume. His silence accomplished everything volume might have and left no obvious evidence. Hallways emptied when he walked through them, not because he demanded it, but because something in the way he moved communicated clearly that his attention was a weight people preferred not to carry. Junior employees took alternate routes to avoid crossing his path. Department heads rehearsed conversations with his secretary before requesting 5 minutes of his calendar. Even the building's most senior vice presidents had a habit of slightly straightening their posture when his name appeared in a meeting agenda. Zuri had watched all of this for 11 months. She had also noticed, because she paid attention to things most people missed, that underneath the architecture of control and fear, Kwon Jae-hwan was genuinely brilliant, occasionally funny in the driest possible way, and carrying something heavy that had nothing to do with the company. She did not know what it was. She had learned not to ask. The morning it changed began with Evan Mercer, who was 26 years old, 3 months into his first real accounting job, and standing outside the executive corridor with the particular coloring of a person whose body had decided that fainting was a reasonable response to the current situation. Zuri spotted him from her desk at 7:48. "Evan," she did not raise her voice. "You're blocking the copy machine from a distance of approximately 6 feet, which means you've been standing there long enough to have made a decision and not made it." "What happened?" Evan turned toward her with the expression of someone who had received devastating medical news. "Put the wrong number in the weekly distribution report," he said. "The wrongs I transposed 2 figures in the Pacific Northwest column, and the totals are off by about $400,000, and it's already been sent to the board preview file, and Mr. Kwon reviews the board preview file every Tuesday morning at -8 o'clock." Zuri finished. "Yes, I know. It's 7:48. Can read a clock, Evan." "He's going to." Evan stopped. "Seemed to recalibrate. People get fired for less. My supervisor got a written warning last month because a quarterly footnote had the wrong font size." "The wrong font size, Zuri." Zuri looked at him for a moment. Then she looked down the corridor toward the closed door of the executive office. Then she looked at the clock on her computer screen. 7:49. She stood up. "Sit at my desk," she said. "Do not touch anything. Do not answer the phone. And please try to breathe at a pace that doesn't concern the nearby security cameras." "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to fix the report." "You can't just—" "He has the file open by now, Evan." Zuri picked up her tablet. "Go sit down." She walked to the executive office, knocked once. Because she always knocked once, it was the rule. It communicated certainty rather than hesitation, and pushed the door open. Jae-hwan was not there. She blinked, looked at the empty chair, looked at the desk, where the silver fountain pen sat precisely where it always sat, where the board preview file was open on the main screen, where a coffee cup had been set down recently enough that she could see steam still rising faintly from the rim. She checked her tablet. His schedule showed a 7:30 breakfast on 42. He was still upstairs. She had 12 minutes. She sat down in his chair. Later, she would not be entirely sure why. She told herself it was expedient. She needed to access the file from his terminal to correct the distribution permissions quickly. She told herself it was practical. But the truth, which she admitted only to herself in the version of the story she kept internally, was that she sat in his chair partly because Evan Mercer was standing at her desk, looking like a young man, about to make a catastrophic life decision based on a transposed spreadsheet figure, and something in her had wanted, very badly. To demonstrate that the chair was just furniture, she corrected the report in 4 minutes. Then she found the pen in her hand. She was not entirely sure how that had happened either. She looked at it, looked at the door, looked at the open corridor beyond the glass partition where 3 junior employees had stopped moving because they had looked at screens and seen with the particular frozen quality of people witnessing something unprecedented. Zuri Bellamy sitting in the black leather chair behind Kwon Jae-hwan's desk, holding Kwon Jae-hwan's silver fountain pen. One of them, Priya from regulatory compliance, had her hand over her mouth. Zuri made a decision. She lowered her voice to something approximating the register of a man who communicated primarily through controlled silence, and she said, loudly enough to carry through the open door, "The coffee arrived 30 seconds late this morning. Obviously, the entire building must be replaced." Priya made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a gasp, but existed somewhere in the uncomfortable territory between them. The junior analyst beside her turned red and looked at the floor. Zuri pointed with the pen, with the precise authority of someone accustomed to directing rooms toward a desk lamp on the credenza that had been slightly off-center for at least 2 weeks. And this lamp has been leaning left all morning. Betrayal always begins with small movements. That was when Priya actually laughed. A real one, surprised out of her, quickly covered but genuinely present. The analyst beside her made a strangled sound. 2 more people drifted toward the corridor door with the involuntary magnetism of people drawn to something they knew was dangerous but could not make themselves leave. Evan from Zuri's desk was staring at her with his mouth open. She stood intending to put the pen down, step out of the chair, restore normal atmospheric pressure to the 41st floor, and turn toward the door. Jae-hwan was standing in it. He had come down from 42 4 minutes early. She would learn later that the breakfast meeting had ended abruptly. She would never know exactly when he had arrived at the doorway, how much he had seen, how long he had been standing there before she turned. She knew, in the immediate present, was that every person in the corridor had stopped breathing. The silence was absolute. Zuri looked at him. He looked at her. He looked at the pen in her hand. He looked at the lamp she had accused of betrayal. Then he looked at the lamp for what felt, to everyone watching, like an extraordinarily long time. Then Kwon Jae-hwan laughed. Not a polite sound, not a controlled professional acknowledgement of mild amusement. A real laugh, the kind that starts in the chest and works its way out, without asking permission. Brief, surprised, genuine, and gone almost as quickly as it came. But it had been there. The corridor remained frozen for a full 3 seconds after the sound stopped. Priya looked at the analyst. The analyst looked at the floor. Evan looked at Zuri. Zuri looked at Jae-hwan. Nobody spoke. Jae-hwan's expression returned to its default architecture, composed, still, unreadable. He walked to his desk, picked up the silver fountain pen, which Zuri had set down the moment she had turned, and found him there, and placed it precisely back in its position. He pulled his chair back. He sat down. He looked at Zuri. "The report correction was caught," he said. "Distribution error." "Been fixed," she stared at him. "Yes," she said after a moment. "It has." "Close the door." She closed it. She walked back to her desk. Evan was still staring at her, with the expression of a man who had watched someone survive a lightning strike from approximately 4 feet away. "What just happened?" he said. It was not really a question. "I fixed the report," Zuri said, and sat down, and picked up her coffee, and did not let her hand shake until he looked away. She spent the rest of the morning waiting. This was not a comfortable kind of waiting, but this was the specific anxious alertness of someone who has done something that cannot be undone and has not yet received the consequence. She processed his 9 o'clock correspondence. She confirmed his afternoon calls. She did everything exactly as she always did, with the extra layer of attention that came from knowing she was being observed, even if she could not see it happening. At 11:17, his line rang, internal. "Come in," he said when she answered. She gathered her tablet. She knocked once. She entered. He was standing at the window, which was unusual. He typically worked from his desk. She had seen him at the window perhaps 4 times in 11 months, and each time it had meant something, a problem he was working through, a decision he was close to but had not reached. "Down," he said without turning. She sat. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the rain had let up slightly, though the sky remained the particular gray of a city that had fully committed to the color. "My brother used to do that," he said. Zuri waited. "Sit in that chair." He did not turn from the window. He had this, he did different voices. Mine, apparently. He would accuse the furniture. A pause. He liked the lamp particularly. Something shifted in the room. Not the temperature. Not anything physical. But Zuri, who paid attention to the things, felt it. "I didn't know," she said. "No." He turned then and looked at her with the flat, precise attention that characterized everything he did. "I know you didn't." She looked back at him steadily. She did not apologize. She did not rush to fill the silence with reassurance. She had learned in 11 months that he found reassurance vaguely insulting. "Min-jae," he said. His name was Min-jae. Another pause. "He died 9 years ago." Zuri did not say she was sorry. She said, "He sounds like someone who was very hard to be in a room without." Something moved briefly across Jae-hwan's face. It was not quite grief and not quite recognition. Expression of someone who had been carrying something for so long that they had forgotten what it looked like from the outside. "Yes," he said. He sat down at his desk. The conversation was over. She could feel it closing, the professional architecture reassembling around the moment, and she stood to leave. She was almost at the door when he said, "There is a warehouse closure order in the document routing system. Pier 7, 30 employees affected, effective end of month." She stopped. "I don't have that on your calendar," she said carefully. "The authorization review. I didn't issue it," he said. The room changed again, a different quality this time. The kind of stillness that precedes a particular kind of problem. She turned back to look at him. His face gave nothing away. But his hands, and she had learned to read his hands, because they were occasionally more honest than his face had stopped moving. "Pull the authorization record," he said, "and whatever other major directives have carried my approval in the last 14 months. All of them." He picked up the silver pen, set it down. Picked it up again, quietly. "How quietly?" she said. He looked at her. "Nobody outside this office," he said. Zuri nodded. She walked out and closed the door gently behind her. She stood in the corridor for exactly 3 seconds. Then she went to her desk, opened the routing archive, and began to look. What she found in the 4 hours that followed made the warehouse closure look like a minor clerical error. Benefits modifications, supplier replacements, personnel transfers, always strategic, always moving people who ask questions into positions where they could not ask them. Procurement changes that redirected contracts to vendors she had never heard of. Payroll restructures that touched departments Jae-hwan had never, in 11 months, given her any indication he was actively managing. Every single one carried his authorization. A sound like green wood splitting, and when she cross-referenced the timestamps against his calendar, the calendar she maintained with the precision of a person who understood that his time was the organization's most critical resource, the picture became something she had to sit with for several minutes before she was willing to accept it. The Pier 7 closure had been authorized during Min-jae's memorial service. She had arranged the car service herself. A benefits restructuring affecting 412 employees had been issued at 11:43 p.m. on a Tuesday 14 minutes after Jae-hwan had landed in Tokyo for a 3-day logistics summit. She had his flight confirmation in her files. There were 11 more. She sat very still at her desk. She was still sitting there, completely still, tablet on the desk in front of her, when she felt someone stop behind her. "Finding anything interesting?" Han Song-wook's voice was pleasant. It was always pleasant. He was 61 years old, immaculately dressed, with the kind of composed authority that came from 15 years of being indispensable to powerful people. He was the senior strategic advisor to Kwon Jae-hwan. He had been with the Kwon organization since before Jae-hwan had taken the company public. He was, by any reasonable account, the second most feared person on the 41st floor. Zuri did not jump. She closed the file she had been reviewing with a single deliberate motion and turned to look at him. "Quarterly contract archive," she said, "just catching up on some filing." Song-wook looked at her with the specific patience of a man who had spent a long time watching people believe they were concealing things from him. "Zuri," he said, with the warmth of a person about to say something that was not warm at all. Making Mr. Kwon laugh this morning was a lovely moment. It really was. I'm sure he appreciated the gesture. A pause precisely calibrated. But I want to make sure you haven't confused his reaction with something more significant than it was. You are his secretary, a very capable one. There's no need to involve yourself in things outside your actual responsibilities. Zuri looked at him for a moment. "You're right," she said. "Good thing I was just doing filing." She smiled. Song-wook looked at her with an expression that did not change but that she registered. In the part of her attention she kept very quiet, as something shifting behind his eyes. "Good," he said. "Good." He nodded once pleasantly and walked away. Zuri waited until he had turned the corner. Then she saved everything she had found to an encrypted personal drive, closed the archive, and spent the next 40 minutes completing the rest of her standard Tuesday responsibilities with meticulous, unhurried precision. Because Han Song-wook had just told her to mind her business. And that, more than anything she had found in the archive, told her exactly where to keep looking. Zuri did not sleep well that night. This was not the restless, vague insomnia of someone who had consumed too much caffeine or watched something unsettling before bed. This was the specific, alert wakefulness of a person who had found something they could not unfind, whose brain refused to stop arranging and rearranging the pieces into configurations that all arrived at the same uncomfortable conclusion. She lay on her back in her apartment in the Central District and stared at the ceiling and listened to the rain still going, Seattle's personal obsession, and went through the list again. 11 directives. 11 timestamps that did not align with the single, verified location of the man who had supposedly issued them. She got up at 4:45, made coffee, sat at her kitchen table with her personal laptop and the encrypted drive and spent 2 hours doing something she had not been asked to do and that nobody knew she was doing. She built a timeline, not the kind that looks organized from the outside. This one was messy, full of arrows drawn and redrawn, notes to herself in the margins of a legal pad, question marks beside dates that needed verification. But by 6:30, when the sky outside had shifted from black to the particular gray that passed for morning in November in Seattle, she had something that felt like the shape of a pattern. The fraudulent orders were not random. They were surgical. Each one targeted a specific category: personnel who asked questions, suppliers who had direct relationships with Jae-hwan rather than intermediaries, contracts that would have required independent review if they had gone through standard channels. Whoever had issued them understood the organization's pressure points. A sound like green wood splitting, understood where scrutiny was least likely, where Jae-hwan's accountant, where Jae-hwan's reputation would prevent anyone from picking up a phone and calling to confirm. She closed the laptop at 6:43, showered, put on the dark green dress that her mother always said made her look like she was prepared to have a serious conversation. Got on the bus. She arrived at Meru Pacific at 7:22. Han Song-wook's car was already in the executive parking structure. She noted this without visible reaction and went upstairs. Jo-won arrived at 7:58. He walked past her desk, said nothing, and went into his office. At 8:04 his intercom clicked. "Come in." She brought the legal pad. She brought the encrypted drive. She brought the printed timeline she had assembled that morning, which was annotated in her handwriting and looked exactly like what it was, the work of someone who had stayed up most of the night, trying to understand something that alarmed her. She set it on his desk. He looked at it without touching it. Then he looked at her. "Sit down," he said. She sat. He read the timeline in silence. He was a fast reader. She had known this, had calibrated document lengths for him accordingly for 11 months. But this time he went slowly. She watched his eyes move down the page and stop. Move again. Stop again. When he reached the bottom, he put the paper flat on the desk and placed both hands on either side of it, fingers spread, and looked at it for a long moment. The Tokyo directive, he said. Benefits restructuring. You're certain about the timestamp? I pulled the original routing record. The system log shows the authorization entered at 11:43 p.m. Your flight landed at 11:29. Japanese customs has a standard processing minimum of 40 minutes for business class international arrivals. She paused. You were standing in an immigration line. He said nothing. There are 11 total, she said. I flagged the ones with verified location conflicts. There may be more that I don't have enough information to cross-reference. He stood up, walked to the window. Seattle was doing its thing outside, low clouds, water on glass, the cargo cranes at the terminal standing in the gray like enormous patient birds. He stood there for close to 2 minutes. Zuri sat and did not fill the silence. Who else has seen this, he said. Nobody. Who knows you pulled the archive? Sung-wook saw me in the system yesterday. I told him I was doing filing. He turned then. Not quickly. Everything about Kwon Jae-hwan was deliberate, but with a quality of attention that had sharpened into something she felt in the base of her throat. What did he say? He told me not to confuse your reaction to the lamp incident with something more significant than it was. She kept her voice level. He reminded me of my job title. Jae-hwan looked at her. And what did you say? I agreed with him. A beat. And then you went home and built a timeline, he said. I went home and couldn't sleep and built a timeline, she said. There's a difference. Something moved across his face. Not quite amusement. Something more complicated than that. He came back to the desk, sat down, picked up the timeline and read it again, more slowly this time, and she watched him arrive at the same conclusion she had. The one she had been avoiding naming directly, because naming it changed everything. This terminal, he said. He pointed to a notation in the margin. She had written, Origin Point 3 confirmed directives, same workstation, non-standard access hours. Senior Executive Terminal, she said. 41st floor, East Corridor. There are 4 terminals with that access level. Yours, mine, the CFO's workstation, and the Senior Strategic Advisor's office. She did not say his name. She did not need to. Jae-hwan set the paper down. The silence that followed was the kind that has mass. Zuri had been in difficult meetings before, had worked in offices where tension was a permanent feature of the air, where bad news arrived regularly and had to be processed in real time. But this was different. This was a man sitting with the specific weight of a possibility he had been at some level aware of and had not let himself fully examine. I need you to keep doing exactly what you were doing yesterday, he said finally. Normal schedule, normal behavior, nothing that suggests the archive access was anything other than filing. And the investigation. Quietly, he looked at her directly. I'm going to start making contact with the employees affected by these orders. One at a time, informally. A pause. I need to understand how much of this was possible because of the directives themselves, and how much was possible because of... He stopped. Because of the fear, she said. He didn't confirm it. But he didn't correct her either. She stood, gathered her legal pad, picked up the timeline. Leave the timeline, he said. She left it, walked to the door. Zuri, his voice stopped her. She turned. You didn't have to do this. The archive pull was what I asked for. The rest of this. He gestured slightly toward the paper. You didn't have to. She looked at him. Evan was going to have a cardiac event over a transposed spreadsheet figure because he was afraid of what you might do. 30 people are about to lose jobs based on an order you never gave. She paused. Somebody around here needs to stay up late doing math. She went out and closed the door. The next 3 days were the strangest of her career. On the surface, the 41st floor operated normally. Jae-hwan held his scheduled meetings. She managed his calendar with her usual precision. Song-wook moved through the office, with his customary ease unhurried, pleasantly authoritative, the kind of man who had spent so long being indispensable that he had ceased to think about what indispensable actually cost. Underneath the surface, everything was moving. Jae-hwan began making quiet calls. Not from his office line, from his personal mobile, during building walks that she scheduled into his calendar as facility review. She knew what they actually were because she was managing the calendar and she was paying attention. And because on the second day, he came back from a 40-minute walk with the particular tightness around his eyes that she had learned meant something had confirmed something he had hoped would not be confirmed. She did not ask him directly. She waited. He told her that evening when the floor had emptied and she was the last person at her desk. He came out of his office with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled and a coffee that had clearly been sitting long enough to be cold, and he sat in the chair across from her desk, not his chair, hers, like a man who needed to be somewhere that was not the room he had just come from. "Richardson," he said, "Pier 7 warehouse supervisor." He followed the closure order because the authorization carried my name, and he said his exact words were, "Nobody calls to confirm the chairman's decisions. You just do it or you disappear." Zuri set down her pen. He said it without anger, Jae-hwan continued. That was the part. He looked at the cold coffee in his hand. He said it like it was just a fact about weather. Like he had accepted it so completely it stopped, feeling like something that should be different. "How many did you talk to today?" 4. Benefits coordinator who processed the healthcare restructuring. 2 accounting supervisors who were transferred after questioning a payment discrepancy. Richardson. He paused. All 4 of them said the same thing, functionally. They obeyed because my name was on it, and questioning my name is career-ending. He set the coffee down on the edge of her desk. "I've been running this company for 9 years, and I just learned that my signature is more terrifying than I am." "That's not a small thing to find out," she said. "No." He was quiet for a moment. "It's not." She looked at him. He looked like what he actually was underneath the suit, and the control and the reputation, a man who was tired. A sound had made decisions over 9 years that had seemed like strength and were now revealing themselves to have had a different shape entirely. "My brother used to tell me, I confuse distance with authority," he said. He said it like a thing remembered suddenly, not a statement he had planned. He thought I used silence, the way other people used volume, to stop questions before they started. Was he right? Jae-hwan looked at her for a moment. "Probably," he said. Min-jae was annoying in that way. He was right about more things than I gave him credit for, while he was alive to be right about them. He picked up the cold coffee again, seemed to realize it was cold, and set it back down. That particular category of regret is its own specific weight. Zuri said nothing. This was, she had learned, the correct response to certain kinds of honesty. Not validation, not comfort, not the rush to make the discomfort smaller. Just presence, and the willingness to let it sit there without being fixed. After a moment, she said, "My father ran a restaurant. Nothing like what you're dealing with. It was a 20-seat soul food place in Renton. And he ran it for 14 years with the specific conviction that showing any uncertainty in front of his staff meant the whole thing would fall apart." She looked at her desk. He never told anyone when things were going badly. He just got quieter and tighter and expected everyone to push harder without knowing why. When it finally closed, 3 of his longest employees told him they had seen it coming for 2 years but hadn't said anything because they thought he knew and had a plan. "He didn't have a plan," Jae-hwan said. "He didn't have a plan," she confirmed. "He just had pride and a really good recipe for oxtail stew." She paused. "He also cried in the parking lot when he locked up for the last time, and I sat on the curb with him for about an hour, and he told me it was the worst thing he had ever done to people who deserved better from him." Jae-hwan was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not the controlled assessment he used in meetings. Something more unguarded than that. "What happened to him?" he said. "He's fine. He consulted for 3 restaurant groups, paid off most of the debts, and currently sends me pictures of his garden every Sunday with extremely detailed commentary about tomato varieties." She met Jae-hwan's eyes. The ending was not as clean as that makes it sound. But it was an ending, and then there was something after it. He nodded slowly. He looked like a man filing something away carefully. Then his phone buzzed on his hip and the moment closed, and he stood and went back to his office, and they did not speak about Min-jae or her father again that night. On the 4th day, she found the source. She had been working through the technical access logs with the patience of someone who understood that the answer was in the data and that the data would yield it if she was methodical enough. The IT director, a careful woman named Candace, who had been told only that there was a routing discrepancy investigation requiring quiet review, had provided her with 3 weeks of terminal access records. The pattern was not hidden. It was simply buried in volume, the way important things often are not concealed behind sophisticated encryption or technical complexity, but present in plain sight in a dataset large enough that a casual observer would lose focus before reaching it. Song-wook's terminal, access times between 9 p.m. and 11:30 p.m. on weekdays. 11 separate sessions over 14 months, each one corresponding within 48 hours to one of the 11 flag directives. She printed the log, wrote the correlations by hand in the margins, highlighted the timestamps in yellow. She put everything in a folder. She picked up the folder and stood up from her desk and walked toward Jae-hwan's office with the particular focused calm of a person who has been building toward a moment and has finally arrived at it. She was 3 steps from his door when she noticed the paper on her desk. She had not seen it when she stood up. It had not been there when she sat down 40 minutes ago. Someone had placed it on her keyboard while she was focused on the printout, and she had not seen them do it. And the fact of that, the specific, cold fact that someone had moved close enough to her workspace to leave something on it without her noticing, made her stop walking and turn back. She looked at the paper. It was a single page, company letterhead. Her name at the top, formal font, the specific formatting of an official HR document. Zuri Bellamy immediate termination. She read the reason. Read it twice. Emotional manipulation of executive leadership. The date on the document was today. The authorization signature at the bottom was not HR. It was not Jae-hwan's. It was Song-wook's. She stood holding the paper and felt several things simultaneously: the cold drop of genuine fear, the hot surge of something angrier than fear, and underneath both of those, with the steadiness a person who had grown up watching her father hold a failing restaurant together through sheer refusal to panic, a clarity that cut through both. She folded the termination order in half, put it in the folder with the access logs. Behind her, the private elevator at the end of the executive corridor made the soft sound of arrival. The one that connected directly to the parking structure. The one that bypassed the main lobby. She did not turn immediately. She made herself breathe once, measured, before she turned. Han Song-wook stepped out of the elevator in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than her monthly rent. He looked at her with the pleasant, unhurried expression of a man who believed he had already won. "I believe you received something," he said. "I did," she said. "Then I think you should give me what's in that folder." She looked at him. He was 61 years old and had been in this building longer than most of the furniture. He had the specific confidence of someone who had survived by making himself the indispensable bridge between the powerful and the operational, a sound like green wood splitting, and who had built an entire system of leverage around the fact that nobody checked the bridge's load-bearing structure when they were too busy using it to get where they needed to go. "No," she said. Something shifted in his face, not dramatically. Just slightly, the way a mask shifts when the person wearing it stops bothering to hold it perfectly in place. "You're a secretary," he said. The pleasantness had dropped about 3 degrees. "You are very good at your job, and you have managed to make an emotionally compromised man feel something he hasn't felt in 9 years. And I understand the appeal of believing that makes you something other than what you are. But you are not an investigator. You are not a member of the executive team. And that folder contains company property that you have accessed without proper authorization. The folder contains terminal access logs," she said, "and a termination order you wrote and placed on my desk while I was sitting at it, which is an interesting level of boldness from someone who apparently prefers to sign other people's names to important documents." The mask dropped another degree. "Give me the folder, Zuri." "No, I will have security." She reached behind her to the corner of her desk and picked up the small device she had placed there on the second day of this investigation compact. Corporate standard, the kind of thing used for conference call clarity in open plan offices. "Press the button," Mr. Kwon, she said, loudly and clearly. Han Song-wook is standing next to a termination order he signed in your name. He is asking me to give him the access logs from his terminal. I'm on your private conference line. Song-wook went very still. The silence in the corridor lasted exactly 11 seconds. Then the executive office door opened, and Kwon Jae-hwan walked out, and the expression on his face was not anger. Anger would have been easier to manage. Anger has edges and volume and uses up energy. It was something much quieter and far more total than anger. The expression of a man who has just confirmed something he had been hoping, against the evidence, was not true. He looked at Song-wook. Song-wook looked back at him. 15 years of history stood between them in that corridor, and every year of it was a different weight than it had been this morning. Song-wook, Jae-hwan said, and his voice was exactly what it always was, low, controlled, without decoration, but something underneath it had changed, so completely that the name itself sounded like the closing of a door. Song-wook made his decision in the space of a breath. He straightened, adjusted his jacket, looked at Jae-hwan with the composed, sorrowful expression of a man about to tell a story he had been rehearsing for a long time, and said, I think you need to hear what this woman has actually been doing. Hong Wook-sa told his story well. That was the thing Zuri would remember afterward, not the content of it, which she had expected, in broad outline, even if not in its specific details, but the quality of the delivery. He was measured. He was sorrowful. He used the word, concerned 4 times in the first 2 minutes, and each time he used it, he managed to convey the impression of a man who had been sitting with a difficult truth for some time, and had finally, reluctantly, decided that loyalty to the organization required him to speak. He told Jae-hwan that Zuri had accessed restricted archives without authorization. He told him that she had been building a file on Song-wook himself, a targeted, selective compilation designed to implicate him in irregularities that were, in reality, standard operational decisions made under properly delegated authority. He told him that the chair incident, which had seemed spontaneous, had been calculated, that Zuri had identified Jae-hwan's emotional vulnerability, had found the precise frequency of his grief, and had deliberately tuned herself to it. She's been asking about Min-jae, Song-wook said. His voice dropped slightly on the name, the way people drop their voices when they're performing respect for something sacred. From other employees, quietly, within her first 3 months, Jae-hwan did not move. She knew exactly what she was doing. When she sat in that chair, Song-wook continued. She knew what it would trigger, and it worked within 48 hours. She had private access to your grief, your personal history, and an informal investigative mandate that no secretary in this organization has ever held. He paused, looked at Jae-hwan with the gentle steadiness of a man delivering terrible news as kindly as possible. I know this is hard to hear. I know what she's made you feel. But she is not what she appears to be, Jae-hwan. She is extremely intelligent, she is extremely strategic, and she has been working toward a specific outcome since the day she was hired. The corridor was completely silent. Zuri stood holding the folder. She could feel the weight of what had just been said settling into the air around her, not because she believed it would work, but because she could measure, with the precision of someone who paid close attention to people, exactly how much of it landed in the places where Jae-hwan was most exposed. The grief. The question of whether he had been manipulated. The specific vulnerability of a man who had spent 9 years keeping everyone at a distance and had, in the space of 4 days, allowed someone close. She looked at Jae-hwan. He was looking at Song-wook. His face gave nothing away. This was its most dangerous configuration. Not the controlled public composure he wore in board meetings, but the absolute stillness of someone who had turned everything internal and was processing behind a wall that had no visible seams. Song-wook turned to Zuri with the expression of a man performing reluctant fairness. You've worked hard here. I don't doubt that. But the right thing is to hand over that folder, accept the decision, and verify everything, Zuri said. Song-wook stopped. She was looking at Jae-hwan, not at Seong-wook, directly at him, with the steadiness of a person understood that this moment had exactly one correct move, and that the move was not to defend herself. I'm not asking you to believe me, she said. I'm asking you to verify everything. Every claim he just made, every claim in my folder, every timestamp, every access log, every calendar entry. She held the folder out toward him. Don't take my word for it. Don't take his. Look at the data. Jae-hwan looked at the folder. He looked at her. He looked at Seong-wook. Something in Song-wook's face moved, a small tightening around the eyes, barely visible, the expression of a man who has just realized that the answer he expected did not come, and that its absence means something he had not fully prepared for. Jae-hwan took the folder. Go home, he said to Zuri. His voice was flat and gave nothing. Both of you. I'll contact you tomorrow. Song-wook nodded with the gracious composure of a man who had won and wanted to be seen winning magnanimously. Of course, I think that's exactly right. Zuri nodded once. She picked up her bag from her desk. She did not look at Seong-wook. She walked to the elevator, pressed the button, waited with her hands completely still at her sides, and rode down 41 floors in silence. She did not let herself feel anything specific until she was outside on the waterfront with the rain on her face, and then she stood there for a moment and let the cold of it settle into her skin and thought, with the particular clarity that comes after sustained tension, finally has somewhere to go, he took the folder. He had not handed it to Song-wook. He had taken it himself. She walked to the bus stop. She went home. She did not sleep again, but this time the insomnia had a different quality, not the racing construction of a mind building a case, but the quiet alertness of someone waiting to find out whether the case they built would hold. The next morning came and went without a call. She sat in her apartment until 10. Made breakfast she did not eat. Opened her laptop and closed it. Stood at her window and watched a delivery truck try to parallel park in a space that was approximately 8 inches shorter than it needed to be, and found the spectacle oddly grounding the specific ordinariness of daily failure. The driver's visible frustration, the eventual decision to take the next block. At 11:40 her phone rang, not Jae-hwan's number. An internal Myru Pacific line she recognized as the executive conference suite. She answered. The department heads are meeting at 2, Jae-hwan said. I need you present. As what? She said. A pause that lasted long enough to mean something. As someone who's going to be asked questions and needs to answer them accurately. All right, bring everything you have. Original files, not copies. I have the originals, I know. He paused again. Song-wook will be there, I assumed. He ended the call. She sat with the phone in her hand for a moment. Then she got up, got dressed in the gray blazer that her mother had once described as her I am prepared to be underestimated outfit, gathered every file, every printout, every annotated log she had assembled over the past week, and went back to the 41st floor. The conference suite at Myru Pacific was a long room with a glass wall facing the water and a table that seated 18. When Zuri arrived at 1:45, 9 of those seats were occupied the CFO, the head of operations, the HR director, 2 regional managers, the head of legal, the logistics director. A sound like board representatives who had clearly been called in on short notice based on the specific quality of their expressions, which suggested they had rearranged significant things to be here, and were not yet certain whether this meeting justified that. Song-wook sat at the far end of the table with the composed authority of a man on familiar terrain. Jae-hwan stood at the head. Zuri took a seat at the side, not at the table, proper but in the chairs along the wall, the position of someone present as a resource rather than a participant. She set her folder in front of her. Nobody spoke for a moment after she entered. There was the particular quality of silence in the room that comes when everyone present knows that they are about to witness something significant and is still processing the specific shape of what it will be. Jae-hwan said, I've asked you here because there is an authorization problem in this organization that has been operating for at least 14 months, and I am responsible for the conditions that made it possible. The CFO, a compact Korean-American man named David Park, who had been with the company for 6 years, looked up with the expression of someone recalibrating a prior assumption. Song-wook's face remained composed, watchful. Multiple directives have been issued in my name during periods when I was physically unable to have approved them, Jae-hwan continued. These directives affected benefits, personnel, supply relationships, and contract allocations. They were followed without question because my name carries a weight in this organization that prevented anyone from picking up a phone to confirm. He paused. That is a failure of leadership. It is specifically my failure, and I want that understood before we discuss anything else. Nobody moved. The board representative on the left, a silver-haired woman named Margaret Chen, who Zuri had seen twice before, and who had the contained, evaluative presence of someone who had heard a great many executive explanations in her career, and had developed sophisticated methods for distinguishing genuine accountability from its performance, was watching Jae-hwan with careful attention. I'm going to ask Ms. Bellamy to present the authorization record she's compiled, Jae-hwan said. And then I'm going to ask several of you to confirm or correct what those records suggest. Starting with you, Evan. Evan Mercer was in the room. Zuri had not seen him when she entered. He was in the far corner chair, the one closest to the door, with the specific coloring of a young man who had been asked to do something terrifying and had said yes out of some combination of conscience and the particular courage that occasionally ambushes people who do not think of themselves as brave. He was wearing his good jacket. His hands were flat on his knees. Song-wook's eyes moved to Evan and registered something that Zuri caught from across the room, a flash of reassessment, quickly smoothed over, but present for one full second before the composure closed back over it. Zuri stood. She opened her folder. She laid out 12 documents across the available space at the end of the table, the originals, annotated, with the timestamp, correlations written in her hand, and the access log cross-references clipped to each one. She walked the room through them without theatrical emphasis. Just the dates, the timestamps, the verified locations, the access records, the correlations between Seong-wook's terminal sessions, and the appearance of each directive. She spoke clearly and did not editorialize, and did not look at Song-wook while she did it. When she finished, the room was quiet. David Park was looking at the documents with the specific expression of a man who manages numbers and has just seen a set of numbers tell him something he finds genuinely alarming. Margaret Chen had her hands folded on the table and was looking at Seong-wook. These are serious allegations, the legal director said. His name was Warren. He was cautious by professional disposition, and he was trying to identify the safest sentence available to him. We'd need independent verification of the access records before. Evan, Jae-hwan said. Evan Mercer raised his hand, which was not necessary but seemed involuntary, the gesture of a man whose body was operating on schoolroom instinct when everything else in him was running on fear. He told me to adjust the Pacific Northwest supplier figures, Evan said. His voice came out steadier than he looked. Mr. Song-wook. He said Mr. Kwon had requested a revised allocation and that I should update the figures and route the change through standard approval. He said if Mr. Kwon ever reviewed it, personally I should say the instruction came through normal channels. He stopped. Started again. He said if I didn't, Mr. Kwon would review my entire employment history. Those were his exact words. The room held very still. Said it like it was just a normal thing, Evan added, with the voice of someone still slightly bewildered by this. Like threatening a junior accountant with career destruction was just a standard management tool. Song-wook turned to look at Evan with an expression that had nothing pleasant left in it at all. That is a significant misrepresentation of a routine. Marcus Richardson, Jae-hwan said, a solidly built man in his late 40s near the door, the Pier 7 warehouse supervisor, who Zuri had not noticed until this moment, leaned forward. The closure order came through with the chairman's authorization. Richardson said, his accent was Pacific Northwest. His voice was even, and he spoke with the particular directness of someone who has decided that if he is going to do something frightening, he will at least do it without decoration. I called the regional office to ask about severance process, and they told me the decision was final and came directly from the top, and that asking further questions was their words not advisable. He looked at Seong-wook. The person I spoke to in regional office reports to you. Song-wook said, warehouse operations fall under my oversight area. Decisions in that transfers, the HR director said. Her name was Patricia Osi, and she had been in this organization for 7 years, and she was looking at the table in front of her with the expression of a woman who had followed instructions she had been quietly uncomfortable with, and was now, in the strange relief of a moment that makes honesty possible, choosing a different path. 3 employees were transferred out of accounts payable. In March, she said. I processed the transfers. The paperwork indicated performance-related reassignment, authorization from the chairman's office. One of them, Lewis, accounts payable senior analyst, came to me privately and said he'd been transferred after he flagged an unusual payment pattern in a logistics contract. She looked up directly at Seong-wook. He asked me if there was a way to review the flag. I told him the transfer had come from the top and I couldn't help him. She paused. I could have made a call to verify that. I didn't, because I was afraid of what verification might reveal about my own role in processing it. The room was so quiet that Zuri could hear the rain on the conference suite's glass wall. Fook sat very still. Jae-hwan was watching him with the flat, complete attention he usually reserved for problems that were about to be resolved. Then Seong-wook made his pivot. Zuri saw it coming, saw the internal decision register in the slight squaring of his shoulders, the small recalibration of his expression from composed denial to something more calculated, and braced herself. This is exactly what I warned you about, Seong-wook said, turning to Jae-hwan with the deliberate calm of a man changing terrain. She has had 4 days with these people. 4 days of conversations you didn't oversee, building a narrative that positions her as the hero of this organization and me as the villain. He gestured toward the documents on the table. These records are selective. Any administrator with archive access can assemble a document package that tells whatever story they want it to tell. This woman sat in your chair and made you laugh, and in 4 days has moved from secretary to de facto internal investigator, and everyone in this room should be asking how that happened and why. He looked around the table. His voice was steady. I have served this organization for 15 years. I have protected its interests, managed its most sensitive operations, and supported this leadership through circumstances that required absolute discretion. He looked at Jae-hwan. I have been here since before Min-jae died. I was here through the worst of it. I know what this company cost you, and I know what it took to hold it together. His voice dropped. Do not let a very clever woman, who has been in this building for 11 months, dismantle 15 years of trust. The room turned toward Jae-hwan. Zuri turned toward Jae-hwan. He was looking at Seong-wook with an expression she could not fully read, and for a moment, a genuine, uncertain moment, she felt the floor of the situation tilt beneath her. Because Seong-wook was right about one thing, 15 years against 11 months was a real asymmetry, and grief was a real vulnerability, and the story he was telling was not impossible. It was just wrong. Jae-hwan said, the meeting is suspended, pending independent review of the access records by our external audit firm. Seong-wook, your system access is restricted effective immediately pending that review. He paused. That is not a judgment. That is a standard protocol for any employee whose terminal is flagged in an authorization investigation. Seong-wook looked at him. Something moved behind his eyes that was not the sorrowful composure he had been performing. Something older and colder and much less constructed. Of course, he said smoothly, I have nothing to hide. Good, Jae-hwan said. Then the review will confirm that. The meeting dispersed. Departments left in clusters. Evan Purser left quickly with the specific energy of a man who had done something brave and needed to go be alone for a while before he processed what it had cost him. Patricia Osi paused at the door, looked at Zuri, and said nothing, but the look was the kind that carries weight without words. Seong-wook was the last to leave. He stood, gathered nothing. He had brought nothing to the meeting, and walked to the door, and paused there with his hand on the frame, and turned back to Jae-hwan. I want you to know, he said, that I understand why you're doing this. I understand the pressure, and I understand that she is very convincing. He looked at Zuri with the specific quality of attention that she felt on her skin like a drop in temperature. Enjoy the temporary appointment, Ms. Bellamy. The audit will take approximately 2 weeks. A great deal can happen in 2 weeks. He left. The room had 3 people in it. Jae-hwan, Zuri, Margaret Chen, who had not moved from her chair and who was looking at the documents Zuri had laid across the end of the table. The access logs, Margaret said. Who generated these? IT Director, Candace Williams, Zuri said. I asked her for 3 weeks of records without explaining the specific reason. She can confirm the generation methodology and timestamp integrity independently. Margaret nodded slowly. The authentication pattern on the directives themselves, has anyone looked at the metadata? Zuri paused. I looked at creation timestamps and terminal origin points. I don't have the technical access to examine document-level metadata beyond that. Get your IT director to pull it, Margaret said. If someone was generating documents under a delegated authorization signature rather than a direct authentication, the metadata will show a different user profile than the displayed authorization. She stood, gathered her notebook. 15 years is a long time to learn a system's weaknesses. She looked at Jae-hwan. The formal appointment as operations coordinator should be documented before end of day. Whatever she found it in 4 days as a secretary. Give her the standing to finish the work. She left. The conference room had 2 people in it. Jae-hwan was looking at the documents on the table. Zuri started gathering them, stacking them back into the folder with the methodical care of someone who understood that the evidence was the most important thing in the room and needed to remain organized. Temporary appointment, Jae-hwan said. Operations coordinator. Formally documented. I heard her, Zuri said. Is that all right with you? She looked up. I'm not interested in a title that someone handed me because I was useful in a crisis. If the investigation produces what I think it will produce, there will be a real role that needs to be filled the right way. And if it doesn't, then I'll have spent 2 weeks doing the most complicated filing of my career, and I'll go back to managing your calendar. She paused. Which, for the record, I am very good at. Something moved across his face. The thing that was not quite amusement. Yes, he said. You are. She closed the folder, picked up her bag, started toward the door. Zuri. She stopped, turned. The IT metadata, he said. Can you get to Candace today? I can get to her in about 20 minutes. Do it. She went. Candace Williams was a methodical woman who had been running Maru Pacific's IT infrastructure for 4 years, and who responded to the request with the careful, unhurried professionalism of someone who understood that what she was being asked to do was significant without needing it explained to her in those terms. They worked together in the server room for 3 hours. The metadata told a story the surface-level access logs had only suggested. Every fraudulent directive had been created using Seong-wook's authentication credentials. But the document properties showed something additional, a secondary user profile, a ghost layer in the generation process. The technical signature of documents created under one identity while routing through another. It was sophisticated, not perfect. Nothing built by a human hand is ever perfect, but sophisticated enough that it required the specific combination of Zuri's calendar cross-references and Candace's technical knowledge to identify it. How long would it take someone to build this? Zuri said, looking at the server output. Candace was quiet for a moment. To build it well? To make it hold up under standard review? She exhaled slowly. Years. This isn't something you construct quickly. This is infrastructure. You'd need access, time, and the certainty that nobody would look too closely. 15 years, Zuri said, more to herself than to Candace. Minimum, Candace said. Zuri looked at the screen. The numbers, the dates, the patient, meticulous construction of a system designed to speak with a dead man's authority and a living man's terror. She thought about the warehouse workers at Pier 7, about Lewis in accounts payable, transferred and silenced for asking a question, about Evan Mercer standing outside the executive corridor, looking like someone about to make a catastrophic decision based on a transposed number, because the atmosphere of fear in that building had made a spreadsheet error feel like a death sentence. She pulled out her phone and called Jae-hwan. The metadata confirms the secondary authentication layer, she said, when he picked up. Candace can document it independently. It's been built over years. This is not a recent operation. A pause. How many years, he said. She says minimum of what the records show, which is 14 months of active use. But the infrastructure suggests longer. She hesitated. Much longer. Another pause, longer this time. All right, he said. His voice was flat in the way that meant he was processing something he had not been prepared to process. Get everything documented. I'll have legal on a call at 8 a.m. She ended the call, sat for a moment in the server room's cool, humming quiet. Then her phone buzzed, unknown number. Seattle area code. She answered. Ms. Bellamy. The voice was even unhurried and belonged to Han Seong-wook. I want to give you an opportunity that I think you should seriously consider. She said nothing. Whatever you think you've found, he continued, you should understand that you are standing in the middle of something that existed long before you arrived, and that is far more complex than a set of metadata records. There are things about this organization, about the Kwon family specifically, that you do not know, and that your employer has very deliberately kept you from knowing. A pause. I think you deserve to know them. Before you finish what you're building. Then tell me, she said. Not on the phone. Another pause. There's a file. Physical, not digital. It has been in my possession for 9 years, because I was the one who ensured it stayed buried. Concerns Min-jae's death. His voice remained even throughout. If you want to understand what you're actually standing inside of, you should see it before the audit team does. The server room was very quiet. Zuri held the phone and felt several things collide. Inside her, at once the alarm of someone being manipulated, which she recognized clearly, and the specific nauseating possibility that underneath the manipulation was something real. Why would you show me? She said. Because you are the only person in that building right now who Jae-hwan will listen to, Song-wook said. And what's in that file will either end this investigation or change what it's about entirely. I'd rather you see it than have it surface through the audit in a way that he paused, very deliberately destroys more than one person. She looked at the server output on the screen in front of her. 14 months of documented fraud, years of careful construction, 30 workers, 400 employees who lost benefits, Lewis in accounts payable, Evan Mercer in his good jacket. Tell me where, she said. She told Jae-hwan. This was not a difficult decision. She had considered for approximately 45 seconds the version of events in which she went alone and gathered whatever Song-wook had to show her and brought it back independently. She had dismissed it, not because she was afraid, though she was, in the measured, clear-eyed way of someone who understands what they're walking toward, but because everything she had built over the past week rested on the principle that evidence had to be verifiable and decisions had to be transparent. Walking into a private meeting with a man who had just been locked out of his system access and threatened her, and her in a conference room doorway, was not compatible with that principle. She called Jae-hwan from the parking structure. He arrived in 8 minutes, which told her he had not been far. He listened to the call account without interrupting. His jaw moved once, very slightly, when she described Seong-wook's mention of Min-jae. Otherwise, his face was the wall it always was. He said it concerns Min-jae's death, Jae-hwan said when she finished. Yes, physical file. 9 years. That's what he said. He was quiet for a moment. He's trying to separate you from the investigation. Get you somewhere private outside the building, with a piece of information that he controls the presentation of. I know, she said. Then why are you telling me instead of declining? Because he said the file would either end the investigation or change what it's about, she said. There's something about Min-jae's death that you don't know something Seong-wook has been for 9 years, then you deserve to know it. Not through me, directly. Something happened in Jae-hwan's face. A movement deep behind the controlled surface brief, tectonic, the kind of shift that doesn't show on the outside but changes the internal landscape entirely. All right, he said, we go together. Seong-wook met them in a private dining room at a restaurant in First Hill that Zuri had never been to, the kind of establishment that existed for people who valued discretion over ambiance. He was sitting at a corner table with a glass of water and a manila envelope that he placed on the table in front of him when they sat down. He looked at Jae-hwan with the expression of a man who was arriving at a version of this conversation he had rehearsed many times in many configurations and had decided on the one that would be most effective. I want to show you something, he said to Jae-hwan. Not to Zuri, to Jae-hwan directly as though she were not there. "And I want you to understand that I've protected you from this for 9 years. Not to deceive you, to spare you something I wasn't sure you could survive." Jae-hwan said nothing. Song-wook opened the envelope. He placed a single document on the table, an insurance investigation summary, dated 9 years ago, 2 pages, formal letterhead. Jae-hwan reached for it. Zuri watched his face as he read. She watched him reach the second paragraph. She watched something change in his eyes, not dramatically, not in the way of theatrical revelation, but in the slow, terrible way of someone reading a sentence that rearranges every sentence that came before it. She looked at the document from her angle. She could not read all of it, but she could read the heading of the relevant section. Vehicle Assignment Modification Authorization Record, 1 hour prior to incident. She looked at Song-wook. He was watching Jae-hwan with the expression of a man performing grief. Jae-hwan set the document down. He put both hands flat on the table. He looked at the document for a long time without speaking. "The vehicle," he said finally. His voice had a quality she had never heard in it. Stripped of everything. Flat in the way of something that has had all its air removed. The assignment was changed. 1 hour before, Seong-wook said. "I found this in the original investigation file. The insurance company flagged it internally, but the external report was it was incomplete. The police investigation was closed before this could be examined properly." "Who changed the assignment?" Jae-hwan said. Song-wook looked at him steadily. "That's what the authorization record shows," he said, and pointed to a line near the bottom of the page. Zuri looked. The authorization line had a name on it. Not Seong-wook's. The name belonged to the Kwon family's logistics coordinator, a man who had died of a heart attack 6 years ago and who could not, under any circumstances, answer questions. Jae-hwan looked at the name. He looked at it for a long time. "He's been dead for 6 years," he said. "Yes," Song-wook said. "Which is why I never brought this forward. The only authorization record we have points to a man who cannot defend himself or explain his actions. Surfacing this would have destroyed his family's reputation, destabilized the investigation into the original incident, and given you nothing except more grief and fewer answers." He paused. "I made a judgment call. I kept it buried. I kept you from carrying it." Another pause. "And now your secretary has decided that because I made operational decisions under delegated authority, I am a criminal." Jae-hwan had not taken his eyes off the document. Zuri was very still. She was looking at the authorization record, at the name, at the formatting of the document itself, the typeface, the header layout, the specific way the timestamp appeared in the corner. And something in the part of her brain that had spent 2 weeks looking at forged documents was running a comparison. She could not yet fully articulate, but could not ignore. "Can I hold this?" she said. Both men looked at her. She looked at Seong-wook directly. "The document. Can I examine it?" Song-wook's face held perfectly still for 1 second, too long. "It's a sensitive record," he said. "I brought it to show. I've spent 2 weeks looking at authorization records," she said. Her voice was even. "I'd like to look at this one." Jae-hwan picked up the document and handed it to her. Song-wook's hands moved slightly on the table, an involuntary reaching that he stopped before it completed. Zuri looked at the document carefully. The paper, the typeface, the header layout, the timestamp formatting in the upper right corner. She looked at it for a long time, and then she understood what she was looking at. The timestamp format, the specific sequence of date, time, was identical to the formatting used in every fraudulent directive she had examined over the past 2 weeks. Not similar, identical, down to the spacing between the colon and the hour digit. It was not an insurance investigation document from 9 years ago. It was a document created by the same system that had created the warehouse closure order. The same system that had restructured benefits for 412 employees during a flight to Tokyo. The same system that had transferred Lewis out of accounts payable for asking a question. Song-wook had built it recently and brought it here, and shown it to Jae-hwan, and the name on the authorization line belonged to a dead man who had worked in logistics and could not speak for himself. She looked up at Song-wook. He was watching her with the specific quality of attention of someone who has just seen a door close that they had counted on staying open. A sound like green wood splitting, and she watched him make the calculation, the one that determined whether there was any remaining version of this conversation that went the way he had planned it, and watched him arrive at the answer. There wasn't. It's a forgery, she said. The table went very quiet. Seong-wook looked at her, and for the first time, underneath all the composure and the sorrow and the careful performance of a man who had spent 15 years learning exactly how to be believed, she saw what had been behind it the entire time. Not ambition, not greed, though those had been tools. Something much older and much colder than either of those things. Jae-hwan, Seong-wook said, turning to him with the last of the performance still assembled, you cannot seriously. The timestamp format, Zuri said. She set the document on the table and turned it toward Jae-hwan so he could see the corner she was pointing to. It matches the formatting from every directive in my folder. The same system generated this document. Not 9 years ago, she paused. Recently, Jae-hwan looked at the corner of the document. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at Seong-wook. And in the silence that followed, something shifted between them that could not be unshifted, the last structural support of 15 years of constructed loyalty. Giving way all at once, quietly, without drama. The way a foundation fails not in a single catastrophic moment, but in the accumulated weight of everything that was built on top of something hollow. Seong-wook sat back in his chair. He looked at Jae-hwan with an expression that had finally completely stopped performing anything at all. You should know, he said, and his voice had changed flatter now, the pleasantness entirely gone. What remained something much more fundamental and much more dangerous, that whatever you do next is going to cost you more than you are currently calculating. Jae-hwan looked at him. Min-jae's vehicle assignment, Jae-hwan said. His voice was the quietest she had ever heard it, the real one. Seong-wook said nothing. Jae-hwan said. The restaurant was empty around them. The rain was outside on the window. Water glass on the table had a small ring of condensation beneath it on the white cloth. Seong-wook looked at Kwon Jae-hwan across 15 years and a forged document and the ghost of a dead man's name, and he said nothing at all. And his silence, which had always been a tool, became in that moment the most complete answer he had ever given. Seong-wook's silence lasted exactly 4 seconds. Then he picked up his water glass and drank from it with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who had decided that if the performance was over, he would at least not perform panic. I think, he said, setting the glass down, that we have arrived at a place where anything I say will be interpreted through a lens that has already decided what it wants to see. He looked at Jae-hwan with the flat attention of someone who has stopped managing an impression and started managing an exit. You should speak to your legal team before you make any further decisions tonight. Was it you? Jae-hwan said again. Same volume, same register. The same terrifying quietness. The vehicle assignment. Min-jae. I'm not going to answer that question in this room. Jae-hwan stood up. The movement was not fast. A sound like ticker. That was the particular quality that made it frightening, the deliberateness of it, the way he rose from the chair with the controlled economy of a man who had decided something and was now simply in the process of executing it. He was not shaking. His hands were still. His face had the emptiness of a person who has moved past the place where emotion is a relevant variable and arrived somewhere much older and much more dangerous. Ji-swan, Zuri said it quietly. Just his name. Nothing attached to it. He stopped. He was standing, both hands on the table, looking at Seong-wook, and the quality of his stillness had changed in a way that made the air in the room feel thinner. Seong-wook looked back at him without flinching. Whatever he was not a man who frightened easily, and Zuri registered that the steadiness of him, the refusal to perform fear even now, and understood that she was looking at someone who had spent 15 years in proximity to genuine danger and had made a separate peace with it long ago. Sit down, Zuri said to Jae-hwan. He did not sit down. Jae-hwan. She kept her voice even. Low, the voice she used when she needed him to hear her, rather than the thing she was competing with. If you do what you're thinking of doing in this room, You give him exactly what he needs to survive this. You become the story. He becomes the victim. She paused. Sit down. The room held its breath. Then Jae-hwan pulled back from the table. He did not sit. He stepped back, 2 feet, and stood with his arms at his sides and his jaw set, and his eyes still on Sang-wook, with an expression that contained something she had never seen in him before. Not rage exactly, but the concentrated, absolute fury of a man who has just understood the full geometry of a betrayal that spans 9 years in a grave. The document you brought tonight, Zuri said, turning to Seong-wook. Her voice was steady, and she was grateful for that, because her hands under the table were not. We will have it examined by the same independent forensic team, reviewing the other directives. The metadata will confirm when it was generated. Song-wook looked at her. Course it will, he said, with the first trace of something that was not performance, a flatness, a resignation, or perhaps simply the tiredness of a man who has been running something for a very long time and has arrived at the moment where running it further is no longer possible. Do what you need to do. Where is the original insurance investigation file? Zuri said. The real one. Song-wook picked up his jacket from the back of his chair. I think you'll find that by morning. He stood. He buttoned his jacket. He looked at Jae-hwan one final time with the expression of a man looking at something he has destroyed and is now leaving behind. I did what I did because this organization needed someone who understood it completely, he said. You never did. You inherited it, and you hid inside your grief, and you let fear do the work that leadership should have done. I held it together. He paused. That's not absolution. I know what it is, but it is true. He walked out. Jae-hwan did not move for a long moment after the door closed. Then he sat down. Not with control, he sat the way people sit when their legs have stopped cooperating, a lowering that was more collapse than intention. He put both elbows on the table and his face in his hands, and Zuri sat across from him and said nothing, and let the silence be what it was. After a while, he said from behind his hands, he changed the vehicle assignment. We don't know that yet, she said carefully. We know he built a document to make it look like someone else did. He lifted his face. His eyes were dry, but there was something in them that was worse than tears, the specific devastation of a person whose understanding of a decade of their life has just been restructured at its foundation. Why would he build that document unless there was something real to redirect away from? Zuri had no answer that was both honest and comforting, so she said nothing. Jae-hwan looked at the table, at the forged insurance summary still lying on the white cloth, the dead man's name on the authorization line. Min-jae was 31, he said. He took that car because I was running late, and he offered to go ahead to the venue, and I said, fine. I said, fine. Stop, Zuri said. He looked at her. You've been carrying that for 9 years, she said. Don't carry a version of it tonight that isn't true yet. We get the real file first. Then you carry whatever is actually true. She met his eyes. Not before. He looked at her for a long moment, the kind of looking that is not assessment. Just presence, acknowledging another presence. All right, he said. They left the restaurant at 9:47 p.m. By 10:15, Jae-hwan's security team had located Song-wook's office safe. By 10:40, his legal team was on a conference call. By 11:08, a courier had delivered a sealed physical document box from a law firm in Belltown, a box that, per the cover letter, had been held under sealed instruction for 9 years, with directions to release it to Kwon Jae-hwan upon specific conditions. Song-wook had set that trigger himself, 9 years ago. The conditions, either his own death or a formal fraud investigation opened against him by the Muryu Pacific Board. The board's suspension of his access that afternoon had been enough. Jae-hwan opened the box at his desk at 11:23 p.m. Zuri sat in the chair across from him. The office was empty, the building mostly dark, the waterfront below them lit only by the cargo terminal's working lights reflected on rain-soaked pavement. The real insurance investigation file was 47 pages. Jae-hwan read all of it. Zuri watched his face move through things she could not name and did not try to. 12:41 a.m. he closed the file. He set it on the desk. He sat for a moment with his hands flat on the cover. His name is in the real file, he said, not the logistics coordinator. Sung-wook's. The original investigator flagged the vehicle assignment and ran the authorization back to his terminal. But the finding was buried in a supplemental addendum that was never included in the official summary. He paused. The investigator was paid. It's documented. There's a payment record to a numbered account. Zuri said nothing. He paid someone to kill me, Jae-hwan said. He said it the way someone says a sentence they have been constructing carefully and are now testing for the first time in open air. Min-jae got in the car and Song-wook never told me. He stood at the memorial. He stopped. His jaw worked for a moment. He has stood at that memorial every year for 9 years. The office was very quiet. What do you want to do? Zuri said. He looked at her. His eyes were not the controlled flat surface she had learned over 11 months. They were something rawer than that, something that had been kept behind a wall that had just come down all at once and had not yet rebuilt itself into anything protective. What I want to do, he said, and what we should do are not the same thing. Tell me what you want to do. I want to go to wherever he is tonight, and he stopped. He put one hand flat on the desk and pressed it there, hard, like a man steadying himself against a surface to keep from moving in a direction he has decided not to move. I want to make 9 years mean something immediate. If you do that, Zuri said, he wins. Not legally. Not in any court. But he wins the thing he's always been working toward, the version of you that becomes what he needed you to be. A man who rules through destruction and calls it justice. She held his eyes. That's what he built. Don't become it. The muscle in his jaw moved. I know, he said, I know. We give the file to the independent investigators. Tonight. Before morning. Before he has any more time to... I know. He stood up. The movement had something different in it than the earlier one in the restaurant, not the terrible controlled stillness of someone approaching violence, but the deliberate gathering of a man making a choice he finds genuinely painful. Call Warren. Legal. Tell him I need him in this building in 1 hour, regardless of what time it is. All right. She picked up her phone. Zuri. She looked up. He was looking at her with the expression she had seen in glimpses over 4 days, the one that lived underneath the architecture of control and terror and competence, the one that was not the chairman of Mariu Pacific Holdings, but simply the person who carried him. Thank you, he said. She held his eyes for a moment. Stop being grateful and let me call your lawyer, she said. The corner of his mouth moved. Almost nothing. Something. She called Warren. The next 4 days were the kind of days that compress time in both directions, that feel, while they are happening, like they will last forever, and that feel, from the other side of them, like they happened in a single continuous breath. Warren arrived at the buildings at 1:47 a.m. with 2 associates and this specific mystic grim of a legal professional who has been woken by a call that told him enough to understand that what came next would define the next significant period of his career. He read the insurance file in 40 minutes. He made 4 calls. By 3 a.m., he had established contact with the independent forensic accounting firm that the board had approved for the authorization investigation and had expanded their mandate to include the insurance records. Song-wook, it emerged, had not left Seattle. He had gone to a hotel in Belltown. His lawyer called Warren at 6 a.m. and proposed a conversation about cooperation. Warren called Jae-hwan. Jae-hwan said no cooperation. Full investigation. That was the full extent of the exchange. By 9 a.m., the board had convened an emergency session. By 11, Song-wook's system access had been formally revoked, and a legal hold placed on every document, file, and communication associated with his office, his home network, and 3 related email accounts identified in the insurance file. The payment records to the numbered account were in the hands of a financial crimes investigative firm by noon. Zuri spent those 4 days doing something she had not expected to be doing, which was managing an organization whose senior leadership structure had effectively lost one of its 2 most significant figures, while simultaneously trying to maintain normal operational function for 800 employees who knew. Something significant was happening, but did not know what. She was not doing it alone. Patricia Osi in HR was a steadying presence. The CFO David Park, who had recovered from the initial shock of the conference room revelation with the speed of a man who processed distress by immediately becoming more useful, had taken on the financial compliance review himself. Candace, in IT, was working 17-hour days with a forensic team going through Songwook's terminal history at the granular level. But Zuri was the one the department heads called. She was the one who sat in the interstitial space between Jae-hwan, who was consuming every available hour in meetings with legal and investigators, and the board's crisis management consultants, and the operational reality of a company that needed someone to answer questions, make judgment calls, and keep the daily machinery moving while its executive center was occupied elsewhere. She did not sleep more than 4 hours on any of the 4 nights. On the evening of the 3rd day, sitting at her desk at 8:30 p.m. with a cold coffee and a scheduling backlog that had grown to something approaching architectural in its complexity, she put her head down on her arms for what she told herself would be 5 minutes. She woke up 40 minutes later to the sound of someone setting a fresh coffee on the corner of her desk. She lifted her head. Jae-hwan was standing there, no jacket. Sleeves rolled. He looked like a man who had also not slept adequately and had given up performing the appearance of having done so. "You fell asleep at your desk," he said. "I was resting my eyes." "Your eyes were making a sound." She sat up, pushed her hair back. "I was not snoring. I didn't say snoring." His voice was dry. "I said a sound." She looked at him. "You look terrible." "Yes," he said, without apparent concern. He pulled the chair from beside her desk and sat in it the way he had that first night, with the ease of someone who has given up performing comfort and is simply finding it. "The financial crimes team found the shell companies this afternoon." She straightened. "How many?" 3 logistics companies. Shared ownership structure. The contracts went through Miriu Pacific's standard procurement process, but the bids were structured in a way that ensured they always came in competitive, without ever being the lowest. Songwook managed the evaluation committee. He looked at the desk. 8 million, approximately, over 11 years. Zuri sat with that number for a moment. 11 years. The patient, decade-long accumulation of a man who had decided that the organization he served was also the organization he was entitled to own pieces of, quietly, through the bodies of falsified companies and manipulated procurement and the weaponized silence of a boss whose reputation was too terrifying to question. "He told you he held it together," she said. "Yes." While he was taking it apart, Jae-hwan looked at the window. People find ways to believe they are owed the things they take. It doesn't make it less calculated. It just means the calculation happened early enough that by the time they were executing it, it felt like something they deserved rather than something they chose. She looked at him. "That's very generous." "It's not generous," he said. "It's just I've been sitting in meetings for 3 days being asked about the organizational culture at Miriu Pacific, and I keep arriving at the same uncomfortable place, which is that the conditions that made this possible were not Seong-wook's invention. He found an environment and he used it. The fear was already here. The gap between my office and the rest of the building was already here." He paused. "He widened it. He weaponized it. But I built it." "You didn't build it to be weaponized." "No. But what something is built for and what it becomes are not always the same thing." He looked at the coffee he had brought her. "Min-jae told me that too. Specifically about the management style. Specifically in those terms." A pause, quieter. He would find this entire situation both completely horrifying and somehow also deeply predictable. "Would he say I told you so?" Jae-hwan almost smiled. It was a complicated, almost sad, and genuine simultaneously, the expression of someone recovering the memory of a person through the specific lens of what that person would have said in a situation they could not have imagined. "He would say it," Jae-hwan said, and then he would immediately feel terrible about having said it and bring someone a snack as apology. Zuri laughed. It was short, surprised, and slightly too loud for the empty office, the kind of laugh that comes out before you check whether the situation permits it. Jae-hwan looked at her, and then he laughed too, not the brief, startled sound from the chair and lamp incident, but something slightly longer, slightly less surprised. the sound of a person who is remembering that this is something they can do. The office was quiet again after a moment. "Drink your coffee," he said, "and then go home and sleep. Tomorrow is the board presentation, and I need you at something approaching functional." "What's the board presentation?" "The full findings." "Formal. You're presenting the authorization investigation section." She looked at him. "I'm your secretary." "You're the operations coordinator leading the authorization investigation," he said. The appointment was formally documented 4 days ago as the board member suggested. He stood. "Tomorrow morning, 8 a.m., get some sleep." He went back to his office. She drank the coffee. It was the right temperature, which meant he had timed bringing it to when she would be awake. She noticed that. She noticed it in the specific way. She noticed things not loudly, not with any external evidence, just quietly, in the part of her attention she kept for things that mattered. She went home and slept for 6 hours and came back in the morning. The emergency board meeting convened at 8 a.m. in the main conference suite on the 42nd floor, a larger room than the 41st floor suite, with a longer table and more formal seating and the specific atmospheric pressure of a space that was used for decisions that carried consequence. 12 board members, 4 external advisors, Warren and his 2 associates, the forensic accounting leads, Candace from IT with printed technical documentation. And at one end of the table, for the first time in any formal board proceeding in the history of Maru Pacific Holdings, Evan Mercer, junior accountant, 26 years old, present at Jae-hwan's specific request as a material witness. Sung-wook's chair was empty. The presentation began at 8:07. Zuri presented the authorization section for 42 minutes. She had slept 6 hours, and her voice was steady, and she moved through the documents with the precision of someone who had spent 2 weeks building an argument and now simply needed to give it air. Timestamps, the terminal records, the calendar cross-references, the metadata findings, the specific, irrefutable correlation between Song-wook's system sessions and the appearance of 11 fraudulent directives over 14 months. Nobody interrupted her. When she finished, the forensic accounting team presented the shell company findings. 11 years of redirected contracts. 3 shell companies sharing a single beneficial ownership structure that resolved, through 4 layers of holding entities, to a private trust in Seong-wook's name. $8.3 million. The room was very quiet. Then one of the board members, a man named Harrison, who had been on the Maru Pacific board for 8 years and who had the specific skepticism of someone who has approved many presentations and heard many arguments and has learned to wait for the part where the story becomes complicated, said, "The insurance file." Jae-hwan nodded. He presented it himself, the real investigation summary. The authorization record. The payment to the numbered account. The forensic confirmation that Song-wook's digital signature appeared in the original vehicle assignment modification, time-stamped 1 hour before Min-jae's car exploded on a rain-wet road 9 years ago. He did not raise his voice. He did not perform grief for the room. He spoke the way he spoke in every meeting, with control and precision. But there was a quality underneath it that was new, or not new, but newly visible, the weight of a man who is carrying a real thing in public, without concealing it, and finding that this is both harder and more necessary than concealment. The room held very still when he finished. Margaret Chen, who had been present at the 41st floor meeting 4 days ago, and who now sat at the center of the board table, with the composed attention of someone who has been taking careful measure of everything since the moment she first saw Zuri's document, said, "What are you asking the board to authorize?" 3 things, Jae-hwan said. First, formal referral of the complete investigation file authorization fraud, financial crimes, and the insurance material to independent investigators, with no connection to this organization. Not our legal team. External. He looked around the table. Second, immediate structural reform of the authorization process. Nothing carrying my name is executed without independent verification from a minimum of 2 department heads. No exceptions. This takes effect this week. A pause. Third, full compensation review for every employee affected by the fraudulent directives. Benefits restoration. Wrongful transfer review. Severance for the Pier 7 closure. Retroactive. Harrison said, "That's significant financial exposure." "Yes," Jae-hwan said. "It is. The board will need to review the compensation figures before." "I'll absorb the personal liability for the compensation costs," Jae-hwan said. "The board's exposure is limited to the structural reforms, which cost nothing except the inconvenience of oversight." He looked at Harrison directly. "These are people who followed orders they believed came from me and were harmed by that belief. That is not a legal calculation. That is a straightforward obligation." Harrison looked at him for a moment, then looked at his papers. "All right," he said. The board voted on all three motions. All three passed. Zuri was writing down the outcomes when her phone set to silent and her blazer pocket vibrated. Then vibrated again, then a third time in quick succession. She looked at it under the table. 3 messages from a number she did not recognize. All 3 contained the same attachment. She opened it. It was a video file. She pressed play with the sound off and watched 22 seconds of footage that she recognized immediately: the executive corridor on the 40th floor, the angle from the security camera above the copy machine, the morning 11 days ago when she had sat in Jae-hwan's chair and done the voice and pointed at the lamp. But the footage had been cut. Evan Mercer was not in it. The beginning, his panicked face, his transposed spreadsheet crisis, the specific context of why she had done what she did had been removed. What remained was Zuri alone, sitting in the chairman's chair, speaking in an imitation of his voice, pointing at his furniture with his pen, while employees in the corridor struggled to contain reactions that, without the context of Evan's distress, looked like the reactions of people watching their boss be mocked by his secretary. The video ended. Her phone vibrated again. The new message had no text, just a link. She clicked it, a media aggregator page. A headline that had been posted 40 minutes ago. A headline that read, "Maru Pacific Scandal, Secretary Caught on Camera Mocking CEO, Then Given Executive Power." She put her phone face down on her notepad and looked at the front of the room where the board meeting was concluding and where 12 people were still in the process of voting on motion number 3. She looked at the phone. She looked at the room. She stood up quietly, went to the door, slipped out, and stood in the 42nd floor corridor for approximately 30 seconds while she pre-processed what had just happened. Then she went back in, sat down, and waited for the meeting to end. The video had been distributed to 7 media outlets simultaneously. By the time the board meeting concluded at 10:53 a.m., reporters were outside the building. By 11:30, the Maru Pacific Communications team, a department that had spent the previous 4 days already operating at maximum crisis capacity, had received 214 press inquiries. By noon, every screen inside the building that connected to external feeds was showing some version of the same 22 seconds of footage, most of it accompanied by commentary that ranged from speculative to outright accusatory. The specific accusation, stated in various ways across various outlets, was this: a secretary had identified her employer's emotional vulnerability, staged a performance to trigger it, a sound like greenwood splitting, and leveraged the resulting personal connection to obtain an executive appointment that was now being used to eliminate a senior figure who had tried to warn the company about her. The building felt different by noon. Not panic. Maru Pacific was not an organization that ran to visible panic. Jae-hwan had built it, whatever its failures, with a specific tolerance for pressure. But there was a current in it that Zuri could feel. When she walked through it, the uncertainty of people who are watching a situation and trying to determine which version of the story is real, and who are aware that the version they choose may have professional consequences. She went to her desk and sat down and did not look at the screens. Jae-hwan came out of his office at 12:47. He stood in the corridor doorway and looked at the news feed running on the break room screen at the far end, which was showing the footage on a loop. He watched it for a moment. He turned and went back into his office. His line rang, she answered. "The board wants an emergency reconvene," he said. "This afternoon. They're concerned the media framing will affect the independent investigation's integrity." "When?" 3 p.m. All right, Zuri. A pause. The board is going to ask you to step back from the operations coordinator role, pending the media situation resolving. She held the phone. Do you want me to? She said. No, he said. But I'm telling you that they will ask, and that I am not going to fight that request if it comes from the full board, because fighting, it looks like exactly what the footage is designed to make it look like. You protecting me at the expense of the investigation, she said. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. If I step back, what happens to the document package? It stays with Warren. It's already in the independent investigator's hands. The investigation continues regardless. Then if the board asks, I'll step back, she said. The investigation matters more than the title. He was quiet for a moment. That is either very principled or very strategic. Can it be both? The almost smile was in his voice briefly before it closed again. 3 p.m. Be there. She spent the 2 hours between noon and the reconvened board meeting doing simultaneously ordinary and most psychologically demanding things she had done in 2 weeks. She sat at her desk, and she did her job. Calls routed, calendar managed, documents processed. The daily machinery of a complicated organization kept moving through the hands of someone who was simultaneously the subject of a developing media story and the person responsible for ensuring that the story did not disrupt the organization's ability to function. At 2:15, Evan Mercer appeared at the edge of her desk. He looked like he had aged approximately 2 years and 11 days. He also looked, underneath that, like a person who had done something they had not known they were capable of and was still integrating the information. The video, he said. Yes, the original has the beginning, where I'm standing there, looking like I'm about to pass out. I know. The security system archives everything automatically. 30-day retention. He set a USB drive on her desk. Candace helped me pull it. Full unedited footage, timestamp authenticated, chain of custody documented. He looked at her. You fixed my spreadsheet error. You didn't have to do that. You just stopped. You just did it. Zuri looked at the USB drive. Thank you, Evan, she said. He nodded. Turned to go. Evan. He stopped. Are you all right? He considered the question with the seriousness of someone who understood it was genuine. I don't know yet, he said, but I think yes. Eventually. He went back to his desk. She picked up the USB drive. She turned it over in her fingers once. She put it in her jacket pocket and went to the board meeting. The reconvened session began at 3:03 p.m. The footage had been on every major Pacific Northwest news platform for 4 hours. 2 board members who had not been present in the morning had joined by video. The room had a different quality than the 8 a.m. session, not hostile exactly, but cautious in the way of people who have been blindsided by something they should, perhaps have anticipated, and are now calibrating accordingly. The board chair, a man named Richard Holloway, gray-haired, 67, who had served on the Maru Pacific board for 11 years and who ran meetings with the specific efficiency of someone who had learned that the longer a difficult conversation goes on, the harder it becomes to conclude well opened by addressing the footage directly. We have a significant public perception problem, he said. The investigation is credible and the evidence is strong, but if the primary figure who assembled that evidence is herself the subject of a credibility attack, we have a problem with the story this organization tells publicly. He looked at Zuri. Ms. Bellamy, I want to ask you directly, are you prepared to step back from the operations coordinator appointment temporarily, with full preservation of your secretary position and without prejudice to your standing in the investigation, while we manage the media situation? The room looked at her. Jae-hwan was looking at the table. Zuri reached into her jacket pocket and placed the USB drive on the table in front of her. Complete unedited security footage, she said. Authenticated timestamp chain of custody documented by your IT director. She looked at Holloway. The edited version removes approximately 90 seconds of footage, showing a junior employee in visible distress and the specific context of why I did what I did. The full footage makes the situation clear. She paused. I'd ask you to look at that before making a decision about my role, because the public perception problem you're describing is built on footage that was deliberately falsified to create a specific impression. Stepping back doesn't address that. It confirms it. Holloway looked at the drive. He looked at Margaret Chen. Margaret Chen looked at the drive, then at Zuri, then at Jae-hwan, who was still looking at the table. "Play it," Margaret said. They played it. The room watched 90 seconds of footage that the edited version had removed Evan Mercer's face, his color, his barely suppressed panic, the specific quality of a young man in genuine distress, and Zuri crossing to her desk and standing up and picking up her tablet and saying, with the calm of someone who is solving a problem, not performing for an audience, "I'm going to fix the report." And then the cut to the chair and the voice and the lamp and employees in the corridor, not laughing at their boss, but laughing in the specific surprised relief of people watching someone diffuse a situation that had been making them tense. The room was quiet when it ended. Harrison said, "Who distributed the edited version?" "We believe," Warren said carefully, "that it originated from a personal device associated with Han Song-wook's home network. The distribution appears to have been scheduled for simultaneous release to 7 outlets this morning." "Scheduled," Holloway said. "Scheduled," Warren confirmed. "Preset." Before his access was revoked, the room absorbed this. "He planned for this," Harrison said. "Not a question." "He planned for several contingencies," Warren said. "We believe the footage distribution was one of them. If the investigation moved forward and he could not stop it through direct means, the fallback was to make the investigation's central figure appear compromised." Holloway looked at Zuri. "He needed you to disappear from this." "Yes," she said. "Because if you're gone, it becomes a legal and financial matter, and the human dimension, the employees, the context, the authorization culture that gets buried in process." She said nothing. He had arrived at the conclusion himself, and she did not need to confirm it. Holloway looked at the USB drive for a moment. Then he looked at the rest of the board. "The appointment stands," he said. "Full statement from this board to media correcting the record, with the full footage attached. Warren drafted by 5 p.m. He looked at Jae-hwan. "Anything to add?" Jae-hwan looked up from the table. He had been watching Zuri for the last several minutes with an expression she could not fully parse, something layered, complicated, the specific look of a man watching something unfold that he had not been certain would unfold this way. "The employees at Pier 7, he said. "I want the compensation package communicated to them directly. Not through HR, not through a letter. I'll make the calls myself." The room was briefly, genuinely silent. "All right," Holloway said. Meeting adjourned. The building emptied by 6:30. Zuri stayed at her desk until 7, completing the documentation backlog that had accumulated through 4 days of crisis management. She was methodical about it. There was something grounding in the specificity of calendar entries and routing confirmations as correspondence flags the ordinary texture of a job that still needed doing, regardless of what had been happening around it. At 7:04, her desk phone rang. She answered. "Did you eat today?" Jae-hwan said. She thought about it. A granola bar at approximately 11:15. A pause. "That is not eating. It has nutritional content." "Come in," he said. She gathered her things and knocked once and went in. He was at his desk. 2 takeout containers were open at the corner of it. Rice, something that smelled like it had ginger in it. He gestured toward the chair, across from him, without looking up from what he was reading. She sat. She ate. Food was good, and she was hungrier than she had realized. And for a few minutes neither of them said anything, which was its own kind of ease, the specific ease of 2 people who have spent 2 weeks in high-pressure proximity and have arrived, without planning it, at the capacity for ordinary silence. "The investigators called at 6, he said. "The payment records from the insurance file traced cleanly. There's a direct financial link between Seong-wook's numbered account and a mechanic who was employed at the vehicle maintenance facility 9 years ago." He set down his fork. The mechanic modified the car assignment protocol and prepared the device. He paused. "The mechanic died 4 years ago. Accident." "Convenient," Zuri said quietly. "Yes." His voice had the flatness of someone who has spent a long day processing things that should not be processable in a single day and has arrived at something not quite acceptance, and not quite its opposite. He covered every exit: the dead logistics coordinator, the dead mechanic, the suppressed insurance addendum, the forged document to redirect the authorization. He looked at his food. He spent 9 years making himself indispensable to a grieving man who had stopped asking questions. She looked at him. What happens now to him? Fraud, conspiracy, financial crimes. The investigators will determine whether the insurance evidence supports a charge relating to Min-jae's death. That he stopped. That will take longer. The mechanic is dead. The original investigator who took the payment is dead. What remains is financial records and document forensics, and a very good legal argument about what a set of facts implies about a set of decisions. It might not be enough, she said. It might not be, he agreed. For the criminal charge specifically, the fraud and financial crimes, those are solid. He will answer for those. He paused. Whether he answers for Min-jae, he stopped again. Zuri set down her fork. She looked at him directly. You want to go outside the legal process, she said. He met her eyes. I thought about it, he said. Last night. This morning. Multiple times today. He looked at his hands. I know people. I have the kind of reach that could make specific things happen without legal visibility. He paused. Min-jae would have hated that. He exhaled slowly. He would have said something like, you're not actually powerful if the only thing you can do is hurt people. A pause. He had opinions about everything. He sounds like a nightmare to argue with, Zuri said. Jae-hwan looked at her. The almost smile appeared, and this time it was less almost and more actual, brief, genuine, arrived at through something that was not entirely happiness, but was real in a way that happiness as performance rarely is. He was catastrophically opinionated, Jae-hwan said. About everything. Management philosophy, furniture placement, whether certain fonts were ethically defensible. He paused. He had strong feelings about fonts. What fonts? Comic Sans specifically. That's a universal position. He had a whole argument about it. She laughed again. He looked at her laughing, and something in his face did the thing it had been doing in small increments over the past 2 weeks, the slow, barely visible process of a man learning to let something be seen. The legal process, she said, settling. We give everything to the investigators. We let it do what it can do, and whatever it can't do. We live with, he said. You live with, she said. I'm your secretary. I have much simpler things to live with. He looked at her. The expression that was on his face was not simple, and she did not pretend it was. Temporary appointment, he said quietly. Formally documented, she agreed. The board will open the permanent position when this is resolved. I know. I'm going to abstain from the vote. She looked at him. That's going to be obvious. Yes, he said, it will be. The room was quiet. Outside, the waterfront was its nighttime self-cargo lights. Rain on glass, the particular dark of a city that stays awake but gets quieter after 8. He'll be arrested tomorrow morning, Jae-hwan said. Warren confirmed it at 6. The financial crimes warrant is ready. The investigators will execute it at his hotel at 7 a.m. Zuri nodded. I want to be there, Jae-hwan said. I don't mean I want to watch. I mean I want to know the moment it happens. He looked at the window. 9 years. I know, she said. She finished her food. She gathered the containers. She stood to go, and was at the door, and had her hand on it. When he said, Zuri, she turned. He was looking at her from across the desk with the expression she had no name for the layered, complicated, real one, and he said, when this is over, when the investigation is concluded, and the position is filled, and the board has voted, would you? His phone rang. They both looked at it. He picked it up. She watched his face change as he listened, not dramatically, but with the specific quality of someone receiving information that is landing differently than everything else has landed today. He said, when? A pause. He said, all right. He ended the call. He looked at her. Song-wook's lawyer just called Warren, he said. He's prepared to give a full statement in exchange for prosecutorial consideration on the Min-jae charge. He paused. There are additional records, physical, at a location outside the city. He paused again. Records that The lawyer says we'll confirm the vehicle modification authorization completely. Zuri stood very still. He's going to confess, she said. His lawyer is negotiating what that looks like, Jae-hwan said. But yes, he looked at the window, then back at her. Warren needs me on a call in 10 minutes. Go, she said. The question I was asking, I heard it, she said. We'll finish it. He looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up the phone. She went out and closed the door. She stood in the empty corridor of the 41st floor, her corridor, the one she had been walking for 11 months, a sound like green wood splitting, the one that had emptied when Jae-hwan moved through it and filled back in his wake, and she stood there alone in the quiet of a building at night and let herself feel, for the first time in 2 weeks, the full weight of everything that was about to finally break open. Not relief. Not yet. Something that preceded relief, the specific exhausted, aching awareness of a person who has held something difficult for a long time and can finally see the ground beneath it. She stood there for a minute. Then she went back to her desk, sat down, and opened the scheduling system, and began clearing the calendar for the day that would come after tomorrow, when Han Seong-wook would sit across from investigators and speak the name of a dead man with his own voices, and the long silence of 9 years would finally have somewhere to go. Han Seong-wook was arrested at 7:14 a.m. on a Thursday. Zuri knew because Jae-hwan sent her a single text at 7:16 that said nothing except, done. She was sitting at her kitchen table with her second coffee when it arrived. She read the word, set the phone face down on the table, sat with the specific quality of silence that follows something that has been moving toward you for a very long time and has finally arrived. Done. She thought about the warehouse workers at Pier 7. About Lewis in accounts payable, transferred out of a job he had been good at because he asked a question that inconvenienced a man who was stealing $8 million. About Patricia Osei, processing transfer paperwork she had been afraid to question. About Evan Murr standing outside the executive corridor, looking like a person whose body had decided that cardiac events were a proportionate response to spreadsheet errors. Because the atmosphere in a building had been so thoroughly saturated with fear that a junior accountant had genuinely believed a transposed figure might end his career. About a 31-year-old man who had gotten into a car and driven toward a venue where his brother was running late, because that was the kind of person he was, the kind who moved toward problems, who covered gaps, who showed up. She sat with all of that for a while. Then she washed her coffee cup, got dressed, got on the bus, went to work. The formal statement from Seong-wook came in 3 parts, delivered over 2 days of recorded sessions with independent investigators, his lawyer present, the prosecutorial team present, and at Jae-hwan's specific request, which was granted after significant legal discussion, a representative from the independent financial crimes team present, with full access to cross-reference the testimony against the documentary evidence in real time. Zuri was not in those sessions. She was not supposed to be, and she did not ask to be. She learned what was said the way the rest of the organization learned it in pieces, through Warren, through the formal summaries that Jae-hwan shared with the board, and finally through the criminal complaint filing that became public record 3 weeks later, and that a news outlet published in full, unredacted except for the names of protected witnesses, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon that felt appropriately on brand for Seattle. The sequence as it emerged was this. 15 years earlier, Seong-wook had joined the Kwon organization with a specific plan that he had described, in testimony, as a long-term investment. He had identified Jae-hwan as a man of significant capability and limited emotional range, someone who could build something extraordinary and who would, precisely because of those limitations, create the kind of organizational culture in which a trusted advisor could operate with substantial unsupervised latitude. He had been right about all of it. He had also, within 4 years of joining, begun redirecting small contract allocations to companies he controlled. Not enough to be visible, enough to be, as he had described in testimony, with the flat precision of a man who had given up performing anything, a reasonable return on the time he had invested. The decision to order Jae-hwan's death had come, according to Seong-wook's statement, from a combination of factors. a significant contract negotiation that Jae-hwan had been conducting directly bypassing intermediaries, which bypassed Seong-wook's ability to redirect, and the arrival of Maru Pacific at a scale where the organization's continued growth would require more transparency and independent oversight, which would have ended the shell company arrangement. He had not described it as a moral decision. He had described it as a business calculation. He had said this in the same tone one might use to describe a supply chain adjustment. The investigator's notes, which were included in the criminal complaint, recorded that at this point in the testimony, Seong-wook had paused for approximately 20 seconds. Then he had said, "I understood that Min-jae was in the vehicle. I knew whose car it was. I knew whose schedule had changed." Another pause. I did not stop it. Those 4 sentences were the ones that ran in every news outlet that covered the filing. Zuri read them sitting at her desk on a Tuesday afternoon, and then looked at the window for a long time. She thought about Jae-hwan reading the same 4 sentences, wherever he was reading them. She picked up her phone and typed, "I saw the filing. Are you all right?" She stared at the message for a moment. She deleted it. She put the phone in her drawer and went back to work. At 4:30, Jae-hwan's office door opened. He walked to her desk with his jacket on and his keys in his hand, which was unusual for this hour. "I'm going to the memorial site," he said. Where it happened, he looked at her. "I haven't been since the first year." She looked up at him. "Do you want company?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I don't know," he said, which was, she had learned, the most honest answer he gave to difficult questions. "I'll get my coat," she said. He did not say yes. He did not say no. He stood there while she opened her drawer and took out her coat and her bag, and when she was ready, he simply turned and walked toward the elevator, and she walked beside him, and that was how they decided. The site was on the east side of the city, on a stretch of road that had been an ordinary road 9 years ago, and was still an ordinary road, 2 lanes, a left turn signal, a gas station on the corner that had changed ownership twice. There was nothing marking it, no memorial, no sign. Just road and concrete barrier, and the specific, ordinary indifference of a place that had been the center of someone's universe for one moment and had moved on without remembering. Jae-hwan stood at the barrier and looked at the road. It was 4 in the afternoon and still raining softer than it had been, the kind of rain that is more mist than precipitation, and the traffic moved past them in both directions with the unconcerned continuity of people who had somewhere to be. He stood there for a long time. Zuri stood beside him and did not say anything and did not try to. She had learned that about grief not from her own, particularly, but from watching her father lock up the restaurant for the last time, and her mother sit with a diagnosis that took 18 months to resolve, and from the specific education of paying close attention to people for 32 years. Grief doesn't need to be managed. It needs to be kept company. After a while, Jae-hwan said, he was going to be late anyway. He was always late. He ran on a timeline that existed in specific defiance of all actual schedules. He paused. He offered to go ahead because he knew I was stressed about the contract meeting, and he wanted to. He just wanted to take something off the list. His voice was even flat in the way of something that has been said internally so many times it has worn smooth. He was doing me a favor. "I know," Zuri said. "I've spent 9 years," he stopped. Looked at the road. "I told myself he died because of what I built. Because I made enemies. Because the work I was doing had a cost. And he paid it." He paused. That was true as far as it went. But what I didn't know was that the enemy was the man standing next to me at the memorial every year, telling me to stay strong. The mist moved around them. A truck went past, close enough that she felt the air displacement. "He told me that removing Min-jae made me stronger," Jae-hwan said. In the corridor when security came, he said that. He exhaled. I don't know what he thought that would do. He wanted a reaction, Zuri said. He spent 15 years understanding exactly how to trigger you. He wanted to go out, having done that one last time. Jae-hwan was quiet. Min-jae wasn't your weakness, Zuri said carefully. He was the part of you that was still accessible, still reachable. Seong-wook didn't remove a weakness. He removed the thing that was keeping you human. She had not planned to say that. It arrived in her mouth complete, and she said it, and immediately wondered if it was too much, too direct, too presumptuous. The overreach of someone who had been in a building for 11 months and was now standing at the site of a man's deepest grief and offering analysis he had not requested. Jae-hwan turned to look at her. He looked at her for a long moment. The mist was on his face. His expression was not the controlled architectural composure of the 41st floor. It was something older and more exposed than that. He would have liked you, Jae-hwan said. She looked back at him. He liked people who talked back, he said. He had no patience for the ones who managed themselves around him. He said they were just performing the most boring possible version of themselves. A pause. He would have sat at your desk and stolen your coffee and complained about the ergonomics of your chair. I would have given him the coffee, Zuri said. The chair complaint I would have disputed. You would have been wrong. The chair is slightly too low for the desk height. She blinked. I've worked at that desk for 11 months. Yes, he said. And you compensate with your posture, which is why your right shoulder is higher than your left by the end of most afternoons. He paused. Min-jae would have noticed that within the first week and found it unacceptable and done something about it without asking. Zuri looked at him. He was looking at the road again, but the quality of his expression had shifted, still sorrowful, still carrying the specific weight of the place they were standing, but with something lighter threaded through it. The specific lightness of a person who has been allowed to remember someone as funny and irritating and real rather than only as lost. He sounds like a handful, she said. Jae-hwan said. He was the best possible kind of handful. They stood there a while longer. When they walked back to the car, Jae-hwan held the passenger door open. She noticed it in the way she noticed things, quietly and without making anything of it externally, and got in. He drove back through the city in silence. Not the silence of the 41st floor, which had always had the pressurized quality of something being withheld. This was just two people sitting with a particular ease of having been somewhere difficult together and having come back through it without either of them breaking. The formal investigation took 11 weeks to conclude. In that time, Song-wook was charged with fraud, conspiracy, financial crimes, and following the testimony of a fourth witness located by investigators, a former associate of the mechanic who had been present at a conversation that documented foreknowledge with criminal conspiracy in connection with the death of Kwon Min-jae. The charge carried a legal qualifier that Warren explained carefully and at length, and that amounted to this. It was not a murder charge in its strongest form, because the direct physical evidence had died with the mechanic. But it was a conspiracy charge that the prosecutorial team believed would hold, and that carried, if convicted, the kind of sentence that ensured Han Seong-wook would spend the significant remainder of his life in a context that had nothing to do with glass towers or executive suites or the particular leverage of being indispensable to a powerful, grieving man. The trial was set for the following spring. In the meantime, Mireu Pacific rebuilt itself. This was not a dramatic or visually impressive process. It did not look like transformation from the outside. It looked like paperwork and policy revisions and a series of all-hands meetings in which Jae-hwan stood in front of the full company, not the department heads, not the board, the full company, all 843 employees. A sound delivered in 3 sessions to accommodate the building's capacity and said things that the organization had not heard from its leadership before. He told them that the authorization structure had failed because fear had made verification feel more dangerous than compliance. He told them that this was a failure of his construction, not theirs. He told them that the major directive approval process now required sign-off from a minimum of 2 independent department heads, regardless of who the authorization claimed to come from, and that any employee who flagged an irregularity was protected from retaliation by a formal board-level policy that named specific enforcement mechanisms. Told them that anyone who had been transferred, demoted, or had their benefits altered by a directive they were uncertain about should contact HR directly, with his written personal guarantee that the review would be conducted independently and that their identity would be protected during the process. He told them one other thing, which was not on the prepared remarks that Warren had drafted and that Jae-hwan had reviewed and then set aside partway through the first session. He told them about Min-jae. Not everything. Not the investigation details or the legal proceedings, or the specific devastation of standing at a site on an ordinary road in the east of the city. Just the shape of it, that he had lost someone 9 years ago, that the grief of it had made him pull inward in ways that had consequences for the organization, and that a junior accountant's panicked face in a corridor 11 weeks ago had been, through a very specific chain of events that nobody could have predicted, the thing that started the process of making those consequences visible. He did not say that Zuri was the person standing at the center of that chain. But the company knew. Companies always know these things. After the third all-hands session, Zuri was in the break room refilling her coffee when Priya from Regulatory Compliance, the same Priya who had covered her mouth trying not to laugh at the lamp, stopped beside her and said, without preamble, I've worked in 4 organizations in 12 years. I have never once heard a CEO stand up in front of his company and say this was my failure specifically. Not the market, not the economy, not the previous leadership. She paused. I just wanted to say that. Zuri looked at her coffee cup. He's not always going to get it right, she said. This isn't a transformation. It's a start. Priya considered this. I know, she said, but starts matter. She took her coffee and left. Zuri stood in the break room alone for a moment. Then she thought about her father, locking up a restaurant in a parking lot, and the 18 months after that, and the tomato garden on Sundays with its very detailed commentary, and how none of it had been clean or simple or arrived at without cost. Starts matter, she thought, yes. The stolen funds were recovered over a period of 8 weeks through the financial crimes process, not all of it. Because money that has moved through shell companies across 11 years leaves gaps that are permanent, but enough of it. 6.7 million of the 8.3. The remainder was partially offset by the liquidation of assets connected to Seong-wook's personal holdings. Compensation review for affected employees was completed in 6 weeks. A sound like green benefits were restored retroactively for the 412 employees whose healthcare had been restructured under the fraudulent directive. Evan Mercer was promoted to senior accounts analyst following a performance review that his department had described as overdue. Lewis, the accounts payable senior analyst, who had been transferred after asking a question about a payment irregularity, was offered his original position back. He took it. The Pier 7 warehouse workers, 30 of them, the ones whose closure order had been the first thing Zuri noticed on an afternoon when she had simply been trying to prevent a junior accountant from having a crisis, received full severance, retroactive back pay for the period of wrongful closure, and formal letters from Jae-hwan personally. He wrote all 30 of them himself. It took him most of a Sunday. Zuri knew this because he sent her a message at 11:40 p.m. that night that said, 30 letters is a significant number of letters. She had responded, would you like me to proofread them? He had said, no. They need to be imperfect. She had not responded to that because she did not need to. Richardson, the Pier 7 supervisor, called the executive line 3 days after receiving his letter. Zuri answered, because she answered everything. I want to speak to him directly, Richardson said. He had the Pacific Northwest voice, even on the phone flat, careful, nothing wasted. He's in a call until 11, Zuri said. I can put you on his schedule. Tell him Marcus Richardson called, Richardson said. Tell him, the letter was good. He'll know what that means. She left the message exactly as given. Jae-hwan read it and said nothing, but she watched him fold the message and put it in his jacket pocket, and it was still there a week later, when she took the jacket for dry cleaning. Min-jae's annual memorial fell on a Thursday, 6 weeks after the investigation concluded. Maru Pacific had always observed it a small company ceremony, low-key, the kind of thing that lasted 20 minutes, and served as more of a formal acknowledgement than a genuine remembrance. Jae-hwan had historically delivered a pre-prepared statement, and then left early, and the remaining employees had dispersed with the particular uncomfortable relief of people who had fulfilled an obligation they had not been sure how to inhabit. This year was different. Zuri knew it was going to be different when she arrived that morning and found sitting on her desk a small framed certificate. Laminated, slightly crooked, obviously hand-printed in the specific font choices of someone who had found the process extremely funny. It read, in full, Official Certificate of Appointment Director of Completely Unnecessary Opinions, awarded to Kwon Min-jae in recognition of consistent excellence in having views on subjects that did not require them, delivered at volumes and frequencies beyond what was strictly necessary, signed, the management, who was wrong about almost everything you told us, it turns out. She sat down. She looked at the certificate for a moment. Then she very carefully picked it up, carried it to the conference room, where the memorial was being set up, and placed it on the table where it could be seen. The ceremony began at 2 p.m. Jae-hwan stood at the front of the room and did not unfold any prepared remarks. He put his hands in his pockets and looked at the 112 people who had come more than any previous year, Zuri noted, because people will go to things that feel real, and he said, Min-jae used to come into this building on Sundays when he thought it was empty and rearrange my desk. Not dramatically, just slightly. He would move the pen 2 inches, turn the lamp 3 degrees. He said he was conducting an ongoing experiment to determine whether I was capable of noticing small changes or whether I had, in his words, reached a level of self-absorption that made me functionally blind to anything that wasn't a crisis. He paused. The lamp you may have heard about, recently, is a continuation of something he started. There was a ripple through the room. Not laughter yet. Something close to it, surprised and warm. He was right that I was self-absorbed, Jae-hwan said. He was right about most things, which was one of the more exhausting qualities he had. He was also the only person in my life who had the specific recklessness to sit in my chair and impersonate me, and he did it badly, and somehow that made it worse, because I could never even give him the dignity of being a convincing impersonator. The room laughed. A real laugh. The kind that happens when people are given permission to find something genuinely funny in a space that has historically only been given them to find appropriate. Jae-hwan reached behind him and picked up the framed certificate from the table. He held it up so the room could see it. This belongs to him, he said. I should have given it to him when he was alive. I was too much of myself then to do it properly. He set it back on the table. I'm working on being less of that. He looked at the room. His eyes found Zuri's briefly in the way that eyes find familiar things without planning to. Then he said, I have one of his stories if anyone wants to hear it. It involves a copier, a quarterly report, and the specific catastrophic consequences of allowing Min-jae unsupervised access to the laminating machine. The room wanted to hear it, he told it. It was a good story, messy, specific, built on the kinds of details that only come from actual memory rather than construction. It involved 3 ruined documents, a small fire that was technically not a fire, but was not entirely not a fire, and Min-jae's completely unrepentant response to the subsequent conversation, which had apparently been to suggest that the laminating machine's instruction manual was insufficiently clear, and that management should consider that before assigning blame. By the end of it, the room was laughing freely. Jae-hwan was laughing too, not with the controlled, contained quality of the first time, or even the second. With the specific ease of a person who has practiced something enough times that the practice has become the thing itself. Zuri was laughing. The room noticed her and noticed him, noticing her with the specific warm awareness of people who have been paying close attention and understand what they are seeing. Nobody found it inappropriate. Nobody was afraid. After the memorial, the building emptied the way buildings do. After something has been genuinely felt in them slowly, with people stopping to talk in the corridors and the break room, conversations running longer than usual because the atmosphere had been changed by something real and people were reluctant to leave it behind. Zuri stayed to help the events team break down the memorial setup. This was not her job. She did it because it was there to be done, and because she had always been the kind of person who, when something needed doing, did it without calculating whether it was formally her responsibility. She was green wood splitting. She was folding the last of the event tablecloths when she heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Jae-hwan in the doorway of the conference room in his shirt sleeves, which meant he had been back to his office and taken his jacket off, which was its own kind of statement about the state of afternoon. "You stayed," he said. "There was folding to do. There are people whose job is the folding. They had other things. I had a tablecloth." She set it on the stack. It was a good memorial. He looked at the room, the empty chairs, the table, the certificate still sitting where she had placed it. He walked over and picked it up and looked at it, the way you look at something you have been putting off, looking at directly for a long time, and have finally decided costs less than the avoidance. "I made this 2 months before he died," he said. "I had it laminated and everything. I was going to give it to him at his birthday dinner." He paused. Then the dinner was postponed because of a contract negotiation. Then he died. He set it down. It's been in a desk drawer for 9 years. Zuri looked at it. "He would have had opinions about the font," she said. Jae-hwan looked at her. His mouth moved. "He would have said Comic Sans would have been funnier," Jae-hwan said. "And he would have been wrong, but he would have said it. He sounds like he was very difficult to be right around." "He was impossible," Jae-hwan said. "He made everything harder and louder and more complicated, and I would—" He stopped, picked up the certificate again, and looked at it, and did not finish the sentence, and did not need to. Zuri gathered the last of the tablecloth stack. She set it by the door for the events team. She straightened up and turned back toward the room, and found Jae-hwan looking at her with the expression that had no name, the layered, complicated, real one. Someone, and it occurred to her with the quiet clarity of someone who has been paying attention for 11 months and 3 weeks that had been on his face with increasing frequency and decreasing hesitation, sound like green wood splitting, and that the question he had almost asked in his office the night before the arrest had been sitting in the air between them ever since he had not finished it. "You were going to ask me something," she said. That night, before Warren called, he looked at her. "I remember," he said. "You still haven't asked it." He was quiet for a moment. He set the certificate down on the table one final time and turned to look at her with the directness of a man who has spent 11 weeks dismantling the architecture of a culture built on concealment and has arrived, on the other side of that, at something that resembles his actual face. "Dinner," he said. That was the question. When this was over, he paused. "It's over." She looked at him. He looked back. "That's not a question," she said. He almost smiled. "I noticed. Is this an executive instruction?" "Personal request," he said. "And if I say no?" He glanced toward the chair at the head of the conference table. "I'll assume the chair advised against me." Zuri looked at the chair. She looked at the certificate. She looked at the man standing in his shirt sleeves in an empty conference room on a Thursday afternoon, who had laughed today without measuring the laugh first, who had told a story about a laminating machine to a room full of people and let them see him telling it. She thought about the version of this building she had walked into 11 months ago, the hallways that emptied, the junior employees who took alternate routes, the fog of managed fear that had been so thick it had taken a frightened accountant and a crooked lamp to make a single crack in it. She thought about all the ways this was complicated and imperfect and not anything like smooth. "Yes," she said. The word landed in the room, the way quiet things land when the room is ready for them, without drama, without excess, simply present. Saturday said. "Not the building cafeteria. Not the building cafeteria. And I'm paying for myself." He looked like he was going to object to this. Then he looked like he had decided that this particular argument was one he would save for later. "All right," he said. She picked up her bag from the chair she had left it on. She walked toward the door. She stopped in the frame and turned back. "The chair, by the way," she said. "It does have better leadership skills. I stand by the original assessment." Jae-hwan looked at the chair at the head of the conference table. "The chair," he said, "has not managed a single crisis, built one piece of infrastructure, or stayed until 7:30 on a Tuesday doing filing. The chair has also never almost gotten fired," she said. "Valid point," he said. "The chair is ahead on that metric." She laughed. He laughed with her, and this time neither of them tracked the sound, or measured it, or listened to it with the particular bewildered awareness something that had been gone and come back. It was simply what it was, two people in a room at the end of a hard thing, laughing because the room permitted it and because they had both earned the right to take up that much space in it. Permanent senior operations position was posted 4 weeks later. The job description was thorough, the qualifications were specific, and the application process was open, genuinely open, not performatively open, with external candidates considered alongside internal ones and an independent hiring committee, whose composition had been approved by both Warren's team and the board. Zuri applied on the last day of the application window. She submitted the same materials as every other candidate. She did not ask Jae-hwan whether she was competitive. She did not ask the board members she now knew personally to weigh in on her behalf. She did not leverage the fact that she had spent 11 months as executive secretary, followed by 3 months as the person who had been doing the job in practice while the title was being sorted out. She submitted the application and went back to work. Jae-hwan abstained from the hiring committee vote. This was formally noted in the meeting minutes. 3 board members and 2 independent advisors made the decision. The vote was unanimous. Warren called her on a Tuesday morning while she was routing correspondence. "They've made a decision," he said, with the carefully neutral tone of a lawyer who has been asked to deliver news that he has opinions about, but is professionally obligated to present without editorial. "All right," she said. He told her. She sat with the phone in her hand for a moment after he ended the call. Then she put it down. Then she picked it up again and called her mother in Renton. "Baby," her mother said, which was what she always said when she answered, a habit so deeply installed it no longer required context. "I got the job," Zuri said, a pause. Then her mother said, in the specific tone of a woman who had watched her daughter work 3 jobs simultaneously and apply for positions she was overqualified for and keep going through the specific grinding difficulty of not being recognized for what she was. "I know you did." "You didn't know." "I know you did," her mother said again. "Now tell me everything." She told her everything. Not the classified parts, not the legal specifics, but the shape of it, the chair, the lamp, the spreadsheet error, the calendar discrepancies, the late nights, the board meeting, the empty corridor at the end of 4 days that had rearranged her understanding of what she was capable of. Her mother was quiet through most of it. When Zuri finished, her mother said, "Your father is going to lose his mind." "Tell him Saturday," Zuri said. "Tell him I'll come for dinner Saturday." "Not this Saturday? I have something this Saturday." Her mother paused, with the particular patience of a woman who has raised a daughter for 32 years and has learned to recognize when information is forthcoming and when it is not. "All right," she said, "next Saturday." Zuri ended the call. She sat at her desk for a moment in the ordinary Tuesday morning of the 41st floor, the sounds of the building doing its work around her, the cargo cranes visible through the window in the gray November light, the silver fountain pen sitting in its precise position on a desk behind a closed door. She had one more thing to do. She knocked once, opened the door. Jae-hwan was at his desk. He looked up. She crossed to the chair across from him and sat down. She set her tablet on her knee. She looked at him with the even, professional attention she had been giving him for 11 months, and would now, in a different configuration, keep giving him for whatever came next. "The committee called Warren," she said. He looked at her. His face gave nothing, which was still, after all this time, occasionally its own kind of answer. "The vote was unanimous," she said. He looked at his desk. He looked at the pen. He looked back at her. "When do you start?" he said. "The formal transition period is 2 weeks," she said. "Executive secretary responsibilities transfer to whoever HR hires into the role. Operations coordinator responsibilities are already substantially documented." "Yes," he said, "you documented them. That is what I do." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The chair at the corner of the senior operations suite has an ergonomic adjustment that the previous occupant never used. You'll want to look at it." She stared at him. "The previous occupant of that suite was Seong-wook." "Yes. You want me to take Song-wook's office. I want the senior operations director to have the office designated for that function," he said. which happens to have been occupied by the previous holder of that function. A pause. You can redecorate. She looked at him for a moment. I'm going to put a plant in there, she said. Something that will require consistent care and attention, and will die immediately if neglected. That seems like an appropriate operational philosophy. She stood. She was at the door when he said her name, the way he sometimes said it without preface, arriving at it directly. She turned. He was looking at her, from across the room, with the expression that had been accumulating since the morning she had turned in his chair and found him in the doorway. The one that had been adding layers and losing performance with each week that passed, the one that was just his actual face, and said nothing except the thing it had been building towards saying for 11 months. Saturday, he said. Saturday, she confirmed. She went out. She closed the door. She stood in her corridor, the corridor that had once emptied when someone walked through it, that had been a place of managed distance and cultivated fear. That was now simply a hallway in which people sometimes stopped to talk about things that were not the chairman's schedules. And she stood there for a moment in the ordinary November morning and felt the full weight of what had been built and unmade. And built differently in the past 3 months, and what it had cost, and what it had produced, and the specific complicated mix of those two things that does not resolve into a clean category, but is, recognizably, what most real things feel like. Then she sat down at her desk. She opened the scheduling system. She had a 2-week transition to manage, an office to organize, a position to formally begin, a Saturday to get through, and a company of 843 people that was in the early, uncertain, genuinely imperfect process of becoming something different than it had been. She put her hands on the keyboard. She started.